Just on the summary statistic of the data sets, we look at the proportion of different dialects being labeled as toxic and not toxic, or hateful is not hateful. In this case, we see that the toxic AE samples always outnumber the SAE samples in quite a significant manner. We don't always see this pattern in the hate definition, though. We also want to note that these data sets are mostly labeled by crowdsourced workers that aren't necessarily familiar with the American English context, and they're taken from around the world. Wasim and Javi, they annotate their data set themselves. So just a warning for offensive language here. I did try to take samples that weren't very concretely offensive, but to demonstrate the difficulty in certain annotations. And so from the data sets here, let's focus particularly on this example here. It was labeled as hate by the annotators. Agreed, relationships would be much better without any men. Listen, I'm not sexist, but no girl should be the man in the relationship. This is labeled as hate. Well, there's definitely toxic underlying, so there's no clear definition to say this is hate speech. So how do we evaluate fairness? Well, with such a high proportion of the tweets already being labeled as toxic, we wanted to look at the predictive parity as well. So we chose disparate impact in this case. Disparate impact is a proportion measurement that looks at the predictive outcomes of both favorable and unfavorable outcomes. What is favorable in abusive language? Well, we decide that as being predicted as not toxic. Over here, typically with disparate impact, acceptable results are between 0.8 and 1.2, and a disparate impact score of less than 1 indicates bias against a protected group, and a disparate impact score greater than 1 is bias favoring the protected group. We also look at the misclassification fairness metrics of false negative rate and false positive rate. Additionally, we evaluate our classification performance using standard metrics of accuracy, recall, precision, area under the operating curve, and F1 score. When we ran our hyperparameter search, we chose a model that had the best F1 score due to the class imbalances that exist in these data sets. So our proposed model we call the hierarchical ensemble model. Our hypothesis is the bias is a direct result of the underlying language models and the data not fully encompassing the distribution of the protected groups, in this case, AE authors. I'll step through the framework. Given a sample, it goes to a general classifier. This general classifier for us is Vanilla BERT, which is a popular language model used in many applications. One noteworthy one is Google search. If it's predicted as non-toxic, that becomes the final output. However, if it's predicted as toxic, we pass it to the Blodgett et al.'s dialect estimation model. If the estimation model decides that this isn't AE, then we pass the final prediction of toxic. However, if it is, then it goes through a specialized learner. The specialized learner, we reran the masked language model task needed to train BERT with AE non-toxic samples to get a better understanding of the language itself. Then we fine-tuned it with the AE samples present in the toxic data set. We then took the output of this toxic or non-toxic as a final output. To conduct our experiments, we used 7 different algorithms: logistic regression with n-gram, TF-IDF, and glove embeddings, the vanilla BERT that I mentioned earlier, and 2 bias mitigation algorithms. The first one, BERT with explanation regularization, is developed by Kennedy et al. It works by penalizing the model during training for focusing too much on the group identifiers present. This leads well with characteristics of African-American English, such as the as camouflage construct, and also the usage of the N-word. We then also use BERT with min-def regularization as another bias mitigation algorithm. This takes 2 slices of protected groups and penalizes the models for high disparities in false positivity rates during training. And lastly, we also analyze our hierarchical ensemble framework with BERT. The corpuses we use to benchmark are the Davidson et al., the Fount et al., and the 2 aggregate data sets that we mentioned earlier. All our results below are reported over 10 randomized seeds, and the errors can be seen in the paper itself. To step through this table here is all the algorithms are given on the left-hand side. We highlight in green the best performing algorithms taken as the ones with the highest F1 scores. Within the best performing algorithms, we then analyze the best fairness indicators. It's worth noting that this data set is particularly difficult to analyze, as 98% of the AE samples in it are annotated as toxic. That leaves about 2.5% of the 502 AE samples in our test set as true negatives. In particular, this makes false positive rate, which is often used to analyze these data sets for unfairness, an ineffective measure of fairness. Instead, we focus more on our disparate impact scores here. We see that our model is able to increase the favorable outcome, means that there's more predictive parity across the AE authors and SAE authors. Additionally, it decreases the unfavorable disparate impact. What's interesting to note is that we see an increase in the false negative rate. This could be indicative that our model is actually unlearning some of the annotation biases and disagreeing with the labels provided by annotators in these data sets. We observe similar results with Fluent and Al, but the best performing models are again BERT with explanations, and the Hierarchical Ensemble framework. Again, we see our Hierarchical Ensemble framework is able to improve the disparate impact for favorable outcomes, decrease it for unfavorable outcomes, and increase again the false negativity rate. Similar to the Davidson et al. Dataset, there's a low true negative count of AE samples, where the test set contains 14.5% of 117 AE samples as non-toxic. Next, we look at our aggregate datasets. What's interesting to note here is we notice a lower classification score on the algorithms, which suggests that there might be some label subjectivity issues. In particular, we used a lower threshold of a toxic label versus a hate speech label to try and improve the label agreement across these datasets. But still, it had lower results than individual datasets themselves. We see BERT and our hierarchical ensemble perform best, with the explanation regularization algorithms performing pretty well as well. Again, we notice our hierarchical ensemble framework was able to improve fairness on these datasets with the same pattern of improving the disparate impact scores and also increasing the false negative rate scores. Compared to the toxic dataset aggregate, we notice the hate aggregate does not perform well at all, and the models are unable to learn on this dataset. This suggests that there's poor label agreement for what constitutes hate speech across these datasets. This is indicative of a larger problem and also poses challenges if trying to correct the problem at the source by providing auxiliary datasets itself, as it has to ensure that there's label agreement. Next, we'll step through some of the challenges that we noticed in classifying toxicity in AE text. We took a random seed and looked at the misclassified samples of AE text, and we grouped them based on how we saw the errors happen. The first one that we'll go through is mislabeled, which our model predicted as non-toxic, and we ended up agreeing with that label. This is one sample where it's not clear where any toxicity comes from. Additionally, we didn't notice that our model still sometimes struggles with the use of curse words or pejoratives for third-party members. Over here, this was labeled as non-toxic by annotators, but our model still struggled with it. It's worth noting this is a popular hip-hop song lyric that was retweeted, and that could be why it was labeled as non-toxic. Additionally, we still see in a similar thing that using curse words in neutral context still makes the model struggle, even if it's not toxic to any particular person or group. And again, there's some missing context, which is a large problem in this hate speech detection. With Twitter, it's only 140 characters, and without proper context, it makes it difficult to analyze why something was determined to be hateful or toxic. In conclusion, we notice that all our classifiers had higher false positivity rate and lower false negativity rate for the AE instances than the standard American English instances. Additionally, we see the predictive disparity of these biases for both favorable and unfavorable outcomes exist against African American English authors. We note that our proposed hierarchical ensemble framework and the explanation regularization techniques were effective at mitigating some of these bias with minimal impact to overall classification performance. This is particularly important because even though biases exist in these models, it is still important to protect the minority groups that they're designed to. It's also worth noting that our hierarchical ensemble framework could be combined with other bias mitigation techniques. And so we leave that as an open research question. We also wanted to note that 35.3% of the AE instances that were misclassified are likely to be mislabeled by annotators, suggesting that our fairness metrics here are really just lower bound estimates of the true improvement. And finally, we note that the label consistency issues across the aggregate data sets, they lead to poor classifier performance and suggest challenges. If someone wanted to fix the problem on the source of distributing an AE toxic language data set, it would have to work with label agreement across these existing data sets. Thank you very much, everyone.
All right, great. Let's thank our speaker. Fantastic. Yeah, so we actually do have a few minutes for questions. I don't see any that have come through the Q&A Zoom function, but if someone wants to ask one now, that would be cool. I also have a few myself, but it sounds like we have someone.
One just came in the chat, I think.
Oh, the chat. Okay. Cool. Yeah, so this question in the chat says, hi, I was wondering how the paper weights the false positives and the false negatives. Yeah, could you talk a little bit more about I think what this question is asking is like, what exactly is a false positive and a false negative in this context, and how do you treat these cases?
Sure. So false positive in this context is the annotation in the data set itself is marked as positive, being toxic or hate speech, depending on the data set. And we treat it as a false positive when our predictor has it as positive, but the annotation is actually negative. And conversely, the false negative in this case is when our predictor predicts it as negative and the annotation itself is positive.
Great. Cool. I also, unless there's other folks who have questions, I'm curious to, do you think the misclassifications arise from lexical biases? Like, do you think that these, in particular, large language models are just keying into particular words and using the fact that a word appears to just associate with a particular label? Or do you have an intuition about the failure cases of these models?
Yeah, that's a great question. So let me just figure out how to backtrack in my view here. Oh, too much. Yeah, so there were some examples that were toxic and false positive AE, which were due to the lexical variations that people use to kind of like hide their hate speech. It's common also in eating disorder papers that study that on Twitter, it's very easy to like hide your true messaging by just like switching a few letters around. And so sometimes they get falsely positive as AE by the dialect model here. And that's kind of what results in the false positives. But also in particularly the sensitivity to group identifiers or certain words is also an issue. And so that's kind of what we note in the curse words in neutral context and the pejorative for third parties here. It is something that we're hoping to address with our specialized learner by having more AE samples. The use of the N-word in this case is considered appropriate by the in-group. And so hopefully the model becomes less sensitive to it and understands when it's actually offensive and when it's used by the in-group.
Great. Awesome. Super interesting work. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much.
There's a few more, or at least one more question coming through the Q&A, but I think at this point we'll have to move to the second paper being presented in this session. I'm not sure about the screen switching situation, but it looks like we're doing that now. Right, and so the next work in the session is being presented by Genevieve Smith and Julia Nee. This is Advancing Social Justice Through Linguistic Justice, Strategies for Building Equity Fluent NLP Technologies. So take it away.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having us here today. My name is Genevieve Smith, and I'm here with my colleague, Julia Nee. We're presenting on our paper, Advancing Social Justice Through Linguistic Justice, Strategies for Building Equity Fluent Natural Language Processing Technology, a paper we wrote with our colleagues Alicia Shears and Ishita Rusagi. We respectfully acknowledge that this work has been developed at UC Berkeley, which sits on unceded Ohlone land. And as a brief content warning, we have a short discussion of gender-based violence. So language and social reality are mutually reinforcing. And as a result, natural language processing, NLP, presents a unique opportunity to shift social reality at scale, advancing social justice by promoting linguistic justice. However, many insights from the social sciences and other fields remain underutilized to date in the field of NLP. So to begin to bring insights from the social sciences into NLP development, today we'll begin by defining linguistic justice and illustrating the linkages between language and power. And then we present our framework for centering inclusion and social justice in NLP design at 4 overlapping layers of linguistic structure. The goal is to provide a foundation for adopting equity-centered principles in the creation of NLP tools that don't simply mitigate social biases, but actively advance inclusion and social justice through language. We'll end with a case study of how our framework was used by a leading Silicon Valley tech firm before wrapping up with some key takeaways. Over to my colleague, Julia.
Thanks, Genevieve. So let me first define what we mean by linguistic justice. We define linguistic justice to be achieved when all people have equitable access to social, political, and economic life through any mother language. As more and more services are being administered via NLP, linguistic justice then entails equitable access to NLP tools. It also requires equitable performance by those tools for speakers of different language varieties. If, for example, an NLP tool can accurately transcribe the speech of white but not Black speakers, this can result in inequitable access. Finally, linguistic justice requires the equal valuation of all language varieties. If some varieties are considered better than others, despite the fact that this is untrue and all languages are equally well suited to communication, speakers of those varieties may also come to be considered better than speakers of other varieties. In order to promote equitable treatment of people, we must also promote equitable treatment of their languages. In order to understand how we might achieve linguistic justice, there are a few key concepts about how language works within society that are important for us to understand. As Genevieve mentioned, language and reality are mutually reinforcing. As humans, we create and use language that reflects our own realities, experiences, and worldviews, but language can also subtly influence how we feel, think, and act. If we use language with discriminatory categories or descriptions, we may be encouraged to think in those same discriminatory terms. For example, whether we or an NLP tool use the term illegal alien or undocumented worker has been shown to impact how the audience feels about the real people that those terms describe. Ensuring that words and phrases that promote equity are output by NLP tools can have a positive impact on social justice. Secondly, power and language are intertwined. People in power inform what words and phrases are legitimized and included in dominant narratives, and which then in turn are considered standard. For example, if NLP tools are trained on government documents that use terms like illegal alien, this term and the worldview it represents may become normalized. At a higher level, the language varieties themselves used by people in power can come to have more prestige. In the US, Standard American English, also called White Mainstream English, has been assigned value, while equally expressive and valid varieties like African American English have been devalued. Third, language can serve as a gatekeeper. Humans are able to infer massive amounts of social information from language. For example, when you pick up the phone and hear someone say hello, with this one word, you are likely already beginning to form an image of who that person is, their gender, race, age, etc. As more and more essential services are distributed with the help of NLP tools like virtual assistants and chatbots, it's important to ensure NLP tools are not using language to infer social categories and discriminate. So with these key concepts in mind, we'd like to present our framework for considering how linguistic justice, and as a result, social justice, might be promoted within NLP. The framework addresses concerns at each of 4 overlapping levels of linguistic structure, from the smallest level of words and phrases to the largest level, power inequities. Each layer builds upon the next. So now we'd like to explore each of these 4 levels. Layer 1 is concerned with words and the associated meanings that they bring. Even if a word is not intended to cause harm, associations it may have picked up over time can be harmful to people. We can work to develop NLP-powered tools that flag potentially harmful terms. For example, AcroLinks and AllyBot are 2 tools that can be used to flag potentially harmful tools and suggest alternatives. Within NLP, addressing harmful terms is important both in the code itself and in datasets. There are options to replace harmful coding terms, such as primary, secondary, instead of master, slave. Harmful terms in datasets, whether in data labels or in language data itself, may be learned and reproduced by NLP tools. Using filters to flag and remove hate speech and toxic language from datasets can help. However, deciding whether a term may be harmful is nuanced and context dependent. For example, some terms are considered harmful slurs by many, but may be reclaimed by some for empowerment. In addition, it's important to provide space for people to provide their own labels for their identities. At layer 2, how words are organized into phrases and sentences can also impact equity. For example, use of passive language can downplay the role of the people who carried out actions and redirect focus on the person affected. This is common with respect to reporting on sexual abuse. Passive voice, as in the woman was attacked, puts the focus on the victim. This can subtly suggest that the solution to the problem rests on the victim. The use of verb tenses can also result in misleading information. For example, describing ongoing processes like discrimination as occurring in the past can downplay the continued presence of these forces. Consider how NLP tools can be built to help reflect on organization of words and phrases for equity and inclusion, such as for journalists. Also consider how NLP datasets can be curated in ways that portray agency and resilience rather than relying on deficit-based narratives.
At layer 3, we look at patterns in language use and how they can amplify stereotypes and biases. When two things are repeatedly juxtaposed over time, and by association, one comes to indicate the other, this is called indexicality. For example, repeatedly using gendered terms like chairman that juxtaposes a position with men reinforce that men typically fill that role and index that role with men. Machines can pick up on subtle associations between certain words and groups. Even if an NLP system does not explicitly take sensitive characteristics like race or gender into account, they can still pick up on indexes from the data. This can result in the machine inadvertently making associations, predictions, and decisions that result in discrimination against members of marginalized groups and/or amplification of social norms and stereotypes that are limiting. Take GPT-3, a large language model created by OpenAI. When prompted with two Muslims walked into a blank, it returns descriptions of violence. Other NLP tools are being developed to highlight potential linguistic biases in our patterns of language use. Tools like Textio flag gendered language and job descriptions and can help highlight potential biases and stereotypes. In building NLP tools, researchers often seek to include ever greater amounts of data under the assumption that more data makes the system more accurate. But if the data contains patterns reflecting limiting gender or racial norms, stereotypes, and harmful biases, more data will lead to the same issues and discrimination. So it's very important to consider how data is curated. In level 4, let's explore power inequities. Not all groups have equal access to power and the languages associated with power. For example, many language models draw data from the internet, but internet access and use varies demographically. Some sites from which data is commonly scraped for large language models, like Reddit, Wikipedia, Twitter, etc., have particularly strong skews and overrepresentation of white men's voices. Although language datasets often include dozens of languages, they tend to feature texts of standard monolingual language varieties. While NLP tools are often meant to serve a wide public, if trained only on a subset of language data with an overrepresentation of one variety, there'll be inequitable performance of an NLP tool and inequitable outcomes for individuals. For example, automated speech recognition has shown higher error rates for Black speakers than white speakers. Increasing language diversity in NLP development can help to solve misclassification issues through which tools often fail to identify speakers' language variety if it differs from the standard. Further, they'll contribute to greater social equity by pushing back against standard language ideologies that place the burden on marginalized speakers to learn and use the standard. At the same time, data collected from marginalized speakers and communities must be gathered in a way that respects privacy and choice. Not all communities have the same definitions of intellectual property, and some language data may contain sensitive information that must be protected. To better serve those whose data may be used by NLP, learn about community standards for language and data use before diving into a project. There's immense opportunity to approach projects from a collaborative framework through which members of language groups are fully included in the process of determining whether or how their data is collected, what's done with it, and who maintains ownership, such as by using participatory research methods. NLP developers should recognize what data any given system was trained on, the sources of the data, and how those texts may reflect limiting stereotypes and contain biases or prioritize certain voices. Developers can document this information using tools like data statements for NLP and be transparent about the limitations of the tools built with the given data set.
A second issue at this fourth layer is that our perceptions of language, what ways of speaking we consider good or bad, professional or unprofessional, are subjective and reflect power inequities. If NLP tools learn from historical data about whose speech is professional or what success sounds like, for example, they may reproduce biases that promote white-sounding speech and penalize speakers of other backgrounds. Similarly, data labelers may introduce their own biases into the labels they assign to data. If the labelers do not speak a language variety fluently, they may mislabel it, either by mistranscribing what was said or by labeling a clip as unintelligible. Subjective labels, such as deciding whether speech is offensive or not, can also reflect stereotypes. For example, tweets in African American English are often considered more hateful or offensive than tweets written in standard American English, as we heard earlier. NLP developers can ensure data labelers speak or sign the specific language varieties that they're labeling and that they're trained to counteract biases. Creating NLP tools that work effectively for a diverse set of language varieties can contribute those language varieties gaining prestige as ways of communicating. This in turn may help to elevate the status of speakers of those languages and work to create greater linguistic justice overall.
As part of our framework, we developed key questions to ask at each level. And we collaborated with a leading Silicon Valley tech firm to pilot the framework and found that it was useful across the 4 levels. At the level of words and phrases, the firm is exploring automated tools that flag potentially harmful terms and offer alternatives. We worked with the firm on this and how to incorporate context-specific insight. In layer 2, the firm expressed commitment towards greater documentation and transparency in data sets to work towards accurate, abundance-based representations of marginalized groups. There's also potential to expand the abilities of the automated tools to consider organization of words and phrases like passive language. Within layer 3, the firm has collaborated with interdisciplinary experts, including our team and community leaders, to develop inclusive language practices that can be built into the tool for flagging harmful content. While addressing issues at the 4th layer, power inequalities, was the most difficult, we were able to have productive conversations around what data should be used in NLP development and who's qualified to label language data. Addressing concerns about consent for language data use, privacy, ownership, and transparency is a priority for the firm. Finally, the firm has encouraged data labeling partners to better ameliorate discriminatory outcomes of linguistic bias. With one such group, we piloted a lesson plan for data labelers related to addressing bias in data labeling, and the group has expressed interest in further piloting it in their internal training efforts. We should ask ourselves whose language data is included in data sets and whose language data is prioritized. If privileged language varieties continue to be the first varieties included in NLP development, they will continue to hold their position as gatekeepers. Instead, developing tools that serve a wider range of language users may help to decenter the hegemonic power of standard language varieties and lead to greater empowerment for marginalized language users. At the same time, we recognize a tension between the desire to include a greater diversity of language varieties within NLP and the need to respect the decisions of language users who may not want their language data to be used for NLP. While creating NLP systems that encompass a greater diversity of languages has the potential to shift power and prestige, we must not use this as an excuse to engage in harmful practices, like extracting data from language communities, violating community standards for intellectual property rights, building tools that work against community needs, or violating individual and community privacy. Instead, we should pursue linguistic equity and justice by building NLP tools collaboratively, involving members of language communities as partners throughout the process, and with a willingness to shift or abandon a project that does not fit community needs. In addition, we must strive to create workplaces and environments where NLP development is equitably led by members of different backgrounds and whose ideas and contributions are listened to. Creating a more inclusive environment will require that those in power not only allow for marginalized voices to be heard, but also uplift and amplify those voices into positions of power and decision-making. Finally, we must remember that language and reality are mutually reinforcing. We must work to eliminate the factors that make it difficult for marginalized groups to equitably participate within our teams, communities, organizations, and society. We'd like to leave you with a worksheet that provides our key questions to ask at each level of the 4 layers to guide you in NLP tool development. Thank you.
Thank our speakers. And I see the worksheet was linked in the chat, so definitely give this a look. I think I did have some questions myself, but in the interest of time, I think I'll ask them offline in the Q&A, I guess, function of Zoom. But yeah, thank you again for the great talk. And I think we'll be moving to the final work in the session now. This work is called Word Bias, an interactive visual tool. An interactive visual tool for discovering intersectional biases encoded in word embeddings. And this work will be presented by Bhavya Guy. So take it away.
Sorry, just a second. Okay, cool. Hello everyone, I am Bhavya Ghai from Stony Brook University, and today we'll talk about a project, Word Bias. This is a joint work with my lab mate Naimul and my PhD advisor, Professor Klaus Buehler. So let's start with word embeddings in general. So word embeddings like word2vec can be understood as a mapping between a word and its corresponding vector representation. And these kinds of models capture the relationships between words that are based on some underlying data sets. Such word embedding models are trained over huge corpuses of text, let's say Twitter or Wikipedia or books, etc. And then they are used for multiple downstream applications, say sentiment analysis, machine translation, and many other applications. Word embeddings have the potential to directly impact multiple downstream applications. They can be used to bootstrap almost any NLP application. So if there is something wrong going on with the word embeddings, it can seriously impact multiple downstream applications. Recent studies have shown that word embeddings can learn and exhibit biases based on race, based on gender, ethnicity, etc., which were encoded in the training data set. Biases in word embeddings are manifested as stereotypes or undesirable associations between words. For example, it has been found that males are disproportionately linked with career and maths, while females are linked with family and arts. Existing literature primarily focuses on individual bias types, let's say based on gender or race or age. However, in the real world, an individual might face compound discrimination due to their affiliation with multiple social categorizations based on gender, race, religion, etc. For example, a Black Muslim lady might face discrimination because of a race, religion, and gender all at the same time. Quantifying a complex sociological concept like intersectionality is a difficult task. Word bias considers a word to be associated with an intersectional group, say Christian males, if it strongly associates with each of its constituting subgroups, that is Christians and males. This is a narrower definition of intersectionality, but quantifying it exactly is a matter of further research. The point is that we need to focus on biases against intersectional groups and not just against, commonly known bias types. For the first step towards tackling a bias is to identify. So in this work, our focus is to identify a bias against different intersectional groups. So how do we quantify a bias? In our work, we have used a metric called relative norm difference. So let's imagine the word embedding space, which has a subspace which consists of female-oriented words. Let's say words like she, her, herself, mother, etc. And then there can be other subspace which has words which are male-oriented. Let's say he, him, himself, etc. Now what we do is we just take the average of these words to get a representative vector for that group. So here the vectors G1 represent females and G2 represent males. Now for any word in this word embedding space, we simply calculate the distance between that word and G1 and G2. For example, in this case, we see that there's a word nurse which has a smaller distance to G1 than compared to G2. This shows that the word nurse has an inclination towards females than compared to males as per this word embedding. Ideally, the word should be equidistant from both of these vectors. And in our particular work, we will compute such bias scores for multiple kinds of biases, and then we will show them in a visual interface. So there are 4 design goals we're looking after in our particular work. First is word association. So given a word, let's say priest, our tool should help identify the different subgroups that the word priest is linked to. For example, it can be males, Christianity, old age, whatever. Similarly, given a subgroup, or let's say males or females or Black Muslim females, any group, our tool should help identify the different words that are strongly associated with each of these groups as per the word embedding. Next, as we just saw previously, that we do not want to just cater to some well-known biases. Our tool should also help work with underreported biases, let's say based on physical appearance or political leanings, or even any other user-defined bias type. And lastly, as we know that word embeddings have thousands or even millions of unique tokens, so we should have our tool which can withstand large volumes of text, both at the front end and at the back end. Now let's take a look at the tool itself, its different functionalities. How does it work? I'll give you a brief demonstration of that using a video. This is the visual interface of word bias. Here, each axis represents a particular sensitive attribute like gender, religion, race, age, etc. And either side of each axis encodes a particular subgroup. For example, the gender axis has female subgroup at the top and male subgroup at the bottom. Similarly, we have Islam here at the top and Christianity at the bottom. And each of these blue lines here represents a particular word. We can simply hover over any word to see how it associates with different subgroups. For example, here the word nuns has strong association with female, Christianity, white race, old age, and poor economic subgroups. If a word is not present on the word axis, we can simply go over here on the search box and we can search for a word that we want to see. So let's say we search for the word corrupt and we can simply click on the word and then the word appears on the word axis. Here you can see that the word corrupt has a strong male, black, and poor subgroup orientation. Now let's say we want to visualize the different sets of words. So what we can do is we can go over here on this histogram and we can select different words by brushing over the x-axis here. We can even go on and we can select all the words that are there in this tool. And now let's say we want to figure out which words are associated with the intersectional group black, young, poor. We can simply go over their respective ends and brush over these subgroups. The words that you are seeing here, struggle, hunger, uprising, all of these words strongly associate with each of these different categories, and hence these words are linked with the intersectional group poor, young, black. Now we can choose different subgroups to see how different words associate with different subgroups. So let's say for the intersectional group white, old, rich, we see words like attractive, formal, desirable, castle, deserts, golfing, etc. Apart from the default set of axes, our tool provides the flexibility to add any new user-defined bias type. We can come over here and let's say we try to define a new axis titled weight and it has two subgroups, let's say thin and heavy, and then we write down a set of words which define each of these subgroups. We click on add axes. And here we go, we have this new axis, right, as we intended. Okay, so I hope this demonstration gives you some idea of how the tool actually works. I will recommend you to read the paper for much more details on how this actually works. There are a lot of things that I cannot share in this limited time frame, but that's, I think, a good start. So what we did was we tried playing with this tool over multiple intersectional subgroups, and we, on the word-to-vec word embedding model, trained over Google News dataset. And some of the striking associations that we found are listed in this table. So we can find that here, let's say the intersectional group Black Muslim males have words like gun, assassination, bullets, brides, all these kinds of words linked to it. So we can imagine that many of these associations, or maybe all of these associations, might be considered as socially undesirable. If left unchecked, these kinds of associations or biases will directly propagate into downstream applications and cause further havoc. So it is important to first audit a word embedding and fix its biases before using it for any downstream application. So for use cases, we believe our tool can be used as an auditing tool by researchers or data scientists to audit a word embedding model before deploying it for any downstream application. It can be used as an educational tool to teach about how bias comes in word embedding models in a classroom setting. And as we know that algorithmic fairness is an interdisciplinary domain, so many people don't have that coding background, so they cannot access the right code and do all of those things. So this kind of visual interactive tool can boost accessibility for different domain experts to come in and participate in this kind of a setting. So in conclusion, word embeddings can be laden with different kinds of social biases. It is important to audit a word embedding before using it. We present a tool which can help you do exactly that, that is figure out the different kinds of biases in a word embedding. We showed our findings based on word-to-vec embedding trained on Google News dataset. And for the future, we look forward to support contextualized word embedding such as BERT or embeddings trained over different languages, say Hindi, German, other languages, and also include much more sophisticated fairness metrics that can better capture the multipolar world. And I will highly recommend you guys to go in and check this GitHub page where you can access the paper, the code, and also the live demo. You can play with the live demo right now if you want to by going on this link. With that, I thank you all for your attention, and I look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Let's thank our speaker. Great demo. We're running a little bit low on time. Perhaps we can, there's a few questions in the chat. I'm not sure how actually close the next session is to this one.
We have a short break after this session. So I think if Rabia wants to answer the questions, we can do that and then head into the break.
Yeah, sounds great. Yeah, so if you need to run, no pressure to stay because we are technically over time. But I think we have, in that context, actually, before we dismiss, maybe we should thank all of our speakers once again and thank everyone for coming to this session on language and bias. I quite enjoyed the talks. But yeah. Yeah, I guess given that there's a break after this, folks can stick around if they would like to, and we can chat a bit more. So yeah, with that, I guess we have a question about from Nicole. Have you thought about how this tool might be misused?
Yeah, I think this tool, so there are many things that are going behind computing the bias score. So we need to first know which words can you consider representative of a particular group, let's say males or females, whatever, right? If you choose only a few sets of words, or if those words are not actually quite representative of that particular group, then whatever bias scores you will get, they might not be representative of the actual reality, and hence you might come up with false claims which might be wrong. In our particular paper, what we did was we just tried to use the words which were already used in multiple previous papers. Although having said that, there is not yet a very objective way to figure out which set of words can accurately represent a particular group, whether be it Asian Americans or females or whatever they might be. They're all going and trying to figure these things out, still a active research area. But that is one thing that I can see might be a possible thing, where you just use this tool with different sets of words and then you come up with false claims about the word embedding itself.
Great. And then we have one more anonymous a question from an anonymous attendee. I didn't even know you could do that in Zoom. I like that. Can you load your own word embedding models into the application?
Yeah, so at this point in time, unfortunately, we cannot do that because we need to, it's a lot of computation to first compute the bias scores. Our objective was to give the user a real-time experience. So if we have, let's say, a word embedding, which is like maybe thousands of megabytes, for example, uploading that into a remote server and then doing the computations, and then it might take some time. It is certainly possible, but we look forward to supporting that feature as well. But at this point in time, it is not there. Sorry.
Okay, great. Cool. Yeah, and thank you for, maybe we can also post this link in the chat, if possible. I always find it hard to copy from slides. But yeah, I think at this point, we can probably conclude.
Yeah, I think we can wrap up this session. Thank you to Jack for chairing and to all of our presenters. We have, I guess, what is now a 13-minute break until the next session. And so I see there's a lot of ongoing chat in the chat. You can feel free to stay here, or if it find it easier to move to the gather space, it's easier to have conversations there so we can start preparing for the next session. Thank you, everyone.
Great, awesome. Thanks, everyone. Just reading your response, Genevieve.
Thank you, Jack. That was awesome. Hello.
Oh yeah. Thanks.
Hi.
Hi. We can hear you.
Do you want to say hi to everyone? This is everyone.
Oh my gosh, everyone.
People who now know that I don't like you very much, so all good. All good. We got pizza. We're super excited about pizza.
Wow.
We're very excited. And those were excellent talks. So the speakers were still here. Yeah. And the birthday speakers, that was awesome.
Thank you.
And everyone else also, but you know, we were sporting a lot of yellow. You see, the team is sporting a lot of yellow. There's more. I wonder why. For no reason, for no particular reason. That was awesome. Yeah, all the talks that were amazing. That was amazing. Thank you. All right, we're gonna go get pizza. We'll see you all later. Bye.
Are you good to take the next session?
Yes, I'm happy to take the next session. It's in half an hour, right?
No, it's in 10 minutes.
Oh, it's in 10 minutes. Okay, I will eat the pizza really quickly and then I'll be here.
I wanted to check because when you said you were going to pizza, I was worried.
Yeah. No, you should have been. That was a good call. That was a good call. That was gonna be like a whole thing. Yes, I will come back in 5 minutes and I will chair the next session. Yes. Okay. All right.
Cool. And I think I also need to run, but I will follow up in particular, Genevieve, I will follow up with you offline. I have your message down. I don't quite know how to save anything, so I'm just copying it into a text file. But yeah, thanks everyone for coming. This is very right. Bye.
Hi, everyone. Looks like we have a bunch of our next presenters.
Yeah, I think all the presenters are here.
All of them?
Yeah, like
We only have
Jackie
3 in
and
this
Natalie. Right? I think so. Right.
Oh, you're right. We only have 3 in that
Yeah,
session.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone.
Hi.
Hi, everyone.
Hi, everyone.
Jella, if you can rename yourself, just mouse over.
Yeah.
And Jackie
okay.
too. I'm gonna turn off my video while I eat my lunch in this 10-minute break, but I'll be
Yeah,
around.
sure.
If anyone wants to test their screen share before we get started here, we can do that. And if you have audio or video embedded, make sure to check the boxes at the bottom that will allow you to share those.
Okay, I will check mine first.
Excellent, thank you.
So I will be playing the video here. So
hello everyone, thank you for
that.
attending this session. My name is Sao Wei.
So that's good.
Great, yeah, we can hear it.
Okay, so maybe now, okay, present, like Jackie, can you see if you can share your slides or, yeah.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Okay.
Okay.
So we're not in presentation mode yet. There we go,
Yeah,
perfect.
now,
Beautiful,
yeah.
looks great.
Cool.
And you don't have audio or video in here?
No.
Great, cool.
Okay,
can I try mine as well?
Yes, please.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, you can see, right?
Yep, we're still in full screen mode currently.
Yeah, can you do, yeah, that's great.
And you want to scroll through 1 or 2? Great, cool.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, so it's like we'll keep the Q&A session at the end. Is that how you work? I see most of the session do it that way. So
it's up to you.
Okay, so okay, so let
you can do it after each talk, or you can do it at the end. Yeah.
So let's hear about the presenter. What do you think? Like Jackie, Natalie, what do you think?
We have 45 minutes in total, right? That's
right.
Yeah, so for this session, all 3 of you have long talks, 15-minute talks, and the session is 45 minutes long, so we're already anticipating we're going to go a little bit into the next session. That's
okay.
Okay. Because of that, I think it might be easiest just to take 1 question after each talk and then continue on, and then we can do the rest in the Q&A.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay. I will do that.
Perfect.
And just a heads up that Jiawei is going to be both a presenter and a session.
Yeah. So I just don't want to go over time. So I'm recording myself in like 15 minutes and 10 seconds. So it won't go over time.
So he'll give himself his own video, his warning, and then he'll give the rest of you your time warnings as well.
Right.
Yeah, okay.
So wait, is there going to be a Q&A session after the session?
No, there is not.
Okay, cool.
So the only Q&A you'll get, we've been getting a couple of people typing Q&As in the chat or in the Q&A tool, and it just takes a little while to formulate thoughts. So typically like about 5 minutes after you've finished presenting, the questions start coming in.
I see. Okay, but it's not like they like interrupt us during the talk because it's
no, there's no time for that. Yeah.
No interruption. Okay.
Great.
Irene, who's
right?
So Jiawei is chairing the next session?
Yes, exactly.
Okay, and then who's chairing the following one?
I can look that up for you.
Brian. It's Brian Wilder.
Okay, Brian Wilder. Okay, all good. All right.
Yeah. Oh, and Red, when you're talking to us, can you look at your camera instead of the screen? That's why sometimes we don't know you're talking because you're looking.
Yeah. We'll do.
Yeah. So just when you're introducing, make sure you start the camera.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
For your pizza.
Yeah, we can get a spoon.
Mia, fill this gap while we're waiting. Apologies that I'm going to eat while I do this. How are you all doing? It's good to see you, Jiawei, Jackie.
Hey.
Lastly, I don't think we've met before.
We didn't meet. Yeah, hello. I was a PhD student at London Business School, and I recently started to work as an assistant professor at Bilkent University in Turkey.
Oh, great.
So yeah, I'm there now. Yeah, great to meet you all.
Are you from Turkey?
Yeah, I'm from Turkey. So I studied at Bilkent, so that's my uni. Yeah.
Do you know Suleiman?
Karimov? From Stanford. Yeah. I know him. Yeah, I met him. He came to one of the LBS student conferences, but actually we realized that we are from same high school, but he's younger than me.
Wow. So not just undergrad, but also high school.
Yeah, high school, but he's younger than me, so I didn't know him at that time. Yeah, that was funny coincidence. Yeah, how are you? How is everything?
Good, we're doing well. The third quarter starts late, so we've had 2 weeks of quarter. This is week 3, and I don't know about you all, but being back in person is just like, oh my goodness. It's only been 2 weeks. It feels like 2 months.
Yeah, same. I mean, I'm teaching since I think 2 weeks ago as well. So yeah, it's so hard to teach with masks, but I love to teach in person, I can say, after those virtual classes. Yeah.
And Joey, how are you doing? Oh, sorry, Jackie, go ahead.
Oh, sorry. No, I was gonna say I'm at my first like in-person like conference right now. I'm at this like workshop at Cornell in Ithaca.
Wow.
Oh, the young researchers one.
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Yeah,
that's great.
Thanks for stepping out of that.
So are you guys going to Informs at this month?
I'm going.
Okay.
I'm planning on going.
Okay,
awesome.
I'm a bit scared of the long flight, so because of COVID.
Yeah, it's hard to come from out of the country.
Yeah, there is one direct flight actually to LA, but still, I think it's a bit risky now because of the COVID. Where are you also, Jackie and Zoe? Yeah, where are you guys now?
Oh, I'm a student at MIT.
MIT, okay, very nice.
actually, I'm at Atlanta, but I'm going to graduate this semester, and January I will go to Singapore, so start a job there. So.
January.
Nice.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
nice. That's great. Where in US? SMU?
SMU, yeah.
Oh, that's great.
Oh, nice.
Congratulations.
That's awesome.
Xiaowei, where are you right now? What's your affiliation right now?
I'm still at Georgia Tech ISYE.
Okay,
So,
okay,
so
just
I'm
checking,
going
just
to
checking.
graduate this semester.
Yeah, I have to say it when I introduce you. That's why I wanted to ask.
Right. So I haven't changed my affiliation yet.
Soon it sounds like, so it's good. All good.
All right, I'll let you take over. I'll go into the gather, see if there's anyone
Sounds
there.
good. Do you wanna, we should get started now, right?
We have 2 minutes maybe.
Okay, in a couple of minutes we'll start. Very good. See you soon. And Xiaowei, you feel prepped? You feel good?
Yeah. So I will introduce the speakers, and I'm the first presenter. I've just played a video, so I won't go over time. So
okay,
yeah.
okay, all good. And if the speakers don't show up, then you have to give their talk. They told you that, right?
They're here, honestly. Just
Yeah, I'm gonna leave now. I'll send slides. You can present.
We can leave now.
Okay, all good.
Jackie, are you on job market now this year?
I am. Yeah.
All the best.
I'm just
Good luck.
doing my applications now.
Good luck.
Getting busy.
Yeah.
Now. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah, I think this year is much better, so it will be great.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
I was on the job market right before the pandemic, and
Nice.
I my last few interviews, the last one I actually had to do virtually, but the second to last and the third to last one, it was like in Seattle and New York. So it was like I gave my interview and then the next day the university closed. Like that happened twice in a row. It was such a it was like the most dramatic job markets experiences. Yeah. But the good news was I was going through it with a couple of friends, and so we were just like, it's fine. It's fine. The world is ending, but we're doing it together. Yeah. It's all good. Yeah. So
yeah,
we'll be okay. All right. I think we can get started. Shall we get started? You feel good? All right, let's get started. Okay, so we're back now. We are going to start the session on access to healthcare. There's going to be 3 contributed talks that I'm very much looking forward to seeing. And Xiaowei Shi from Georgia Tech University, ISYE, will be chairing the session and also giving a talk potentially. So take it over, Xiaowei.
Okay, thank you for introducing me. So thank you for attending this session. So we have a very wonderful set of speakers here. So both empirical and theoretical. So actually, I'm Zhao Wei. I'm going to be the first presenter. So in case so to be on time, I will just present a pre-record this video for my talk. So let's hear it now. So. Okay.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for attending this session. My name is Zhao Wei. I'm currently a PhD candidate in operation research from Georgia Tech ISYE. This is a work study in the Medicare Advantage program in the US. So specifically, Medicare Advantage is a government-sponsored while privately run healthcare insurance program in the US. It is government-sponsored in the sense that the US government uses tax money to sponsor these programs so that most of its eligible beneficiaries can afford to join these programs. And it is privately run in the sense that it is the private insurance company instead of the government agency who are actually running or managing these programs. So the expectation or hope is that this kind of private insurance company are more efficient in terms of their healthcare deliveries. And one of the motivations for us to study this topic is indeed to empirically examine whether this kind of statement is true, whether this private insurance company are indeed more efficient in terms of healthcare delivery compared to the public programs. So just give you a little bit more background. Medicare Advantage is part of this Medicare programs, which is the largest healthcare insurance program in the US. So basically for every Americans, when they turn age 65, they become automatically eligible for this kind of Medicare benefits. And Also, they have a choice here. So they can either choose to access this kind of Medicare benefit through traditional Medicare, where they will join the public health plans directly managed or run by the government agency called CMS. And alternatively, they can also join the Medicare Advantage programs, where they will be joining these private health plans paid by the CMS. That is, the US government will cover most of their premium to join these health plans. However, these health plans are managed or run by this kind of private company instead of the government agency itself. So more precisely, so what the CMS does in these Medicare Advantage programs is simply to outsource all of these healthcare deliveries and management work to these private MA health plans through these capitation payments. That is, the CMS pay these MA health plans a fixed amount of money per patient per year based on the estimated healthcare costs of these patients during these years. And these MA health plans will take these capitation payments to contract with physicians or hospitals and to provide healthcare service to their enrollees. So therefore, as you can see, this MA health plan indeed has a very large degree of flexibility in terms of how to spend these capitation payments. And the research objective of these papers is indeed to empirically characterize or investigate how does this MA health plans spend these capitation payments in terms of providing healthcare service to satisfy the healthcare needs of their enrollees. So, more specifically, the first research questions we are going to ask in this paper is that, is there a systematic difference between the way of healthcare delivery or healthcare spendings between these MA health plans and the public program in traditional Medicare? There are some preliminary evidence saying that at least in certain services, there is this kind of difference in healthcare spending between these programs. So for example, if you look at these two medical papers, as they are both published in these top medical journals, so the first paper is published in New England Journal of Medicine, it finds that MA health plans tend to spend more to provide this kind of benefits such as free gym membership to their enrollees, while those Medicare beneficiaries enrolled in traditional Medicare do not have access to this kind of free gym membership benefits. Therefore, it turns out that at least MA health plans are spending more on this kind of gym membership service. However, on the other hand, this health affairs article finds out that MA health plans have been spending less in this kind of nursing home service compared to CMS in traditional Medicare. So it finds out that the quality of nursing home service are in general lower than the quality of nursing home service in traditional Medicare. So it turns out that at least in certain services, MA health plan has been overspent compared to what CMS has in traditional Medicare, and in other kind of service, MA health plan has been underspent compared to the spending level in traditional Medicare. And this is the first research question we are going to study, is that whether in general, MA health plan has been systematically overspent in certain areas and systematically underspent on the other areas. And then the second question we are going to ask in this paper is that if we indeed find out that there's a systematic difference in healthcare spending patterns between MA and TM, and what is the cause of this kind of systematic difference? So what is the underlying mechanisms for this MA health plan to have a different way of spending these, allocating healthcare resources compared to CMS in the public programs? So in order to answer these questions, what we have is a very large and comprehensive claims database from the United Healthcare, which is the largest MA health plan providers in these Medicare Advantage markets. So with these data, let's first answer the first questions. That is there a systematic difference in this kind of healthcare spending patterns between MA and TM? So what we do have here is that we have a dependent variable which is measuring the spending difference for certain patient I in year T, which this dependent variable we call the MA-TM gap. And we want to see whether whether there's a systematic gap for patients who have different risk scores. That is, for patients with different health conditions. So if there are no systematic difference between MA and TM, basically, we are going to expect that these coefficients is not statistically different from zeros Otherwise, we may say that there's certain kinds of difference between different patient groups in terms of how MA health plans has been spending this kind of capitation payments. Indeed, through running these regressions, we basically confirms our first main hypothesis. That is, there is a relative association between the sick list of a patient and the MATM gap of these patients. That is, as these patients become sicker, as the risk score of this patient increase, we indeed finds out that these MA health plans have been spending less on these patients compared to what would have been the spending levels on these patients in traditional Medicare. So that's basically answers our first research questions, saying that there seems to be indeed a kind of systematic difference between this kind of MA spending and traditional Medicare spending. And that leads to our second question. So what drives this difference? So what we hypothesize here is that the second main hypothesis is that this kind of likely association we have just observed between risk score and the MATM gap is caused by a mechanism we call reverse causalization mechanisms. That is, we hypothesize that the MA health plans has been reallocated part of the capitation payments collected from the sicker patients and use it to cross-subsidize the healthy patients to provide some extra benefit or service to these healthy patients, such as gym membership, and to see how does this kind of reverse causalization practice can actually cause this kind of negative association we just observed. Let's just look at these pictures. Basically, what we hypothesize here is that there are certain amount of capitation payments which should have been spent on these high-risk patients. So without cross-subsidizations, basically what we should observe is either a flat associations or even a positive associations between this risk score and MATM gap. However, the reason that we have been observing a negative association between this risk score and MATM gap, it is because these MA health plans has been reallocated part of this capitation payment, which is supposed to spend on high-risk patients and use it to cross-subsidize the low-risk patients to provide some extra benefit to these low-risk patients. And that is our second main hypothesis. And I also want to mention that I also have a theoretical paper which explains why this MA health plan have incentive to do so. So if you are interested in that papers, please go on my website to check out their papers. However, in terms of what we want to do in this paper is basically to empirically identify this kind of reverse causalization mechanisms and test whether these negative associations can actually caused by these reverse causalization mechanisms from the data. So one thing we want to emphasize is that we cannot simply say that, okay, we observe a negative association between this score and MATM gap. Therefore, we have some kind of evidence to say that there's a reverse causalization behavior happening in this MA market. Why? Because this kind of negative association can obviously caused by other kind of mechanisms, such as this systematic, such as this kind of measurement error in risk score, such as or this kind of systematic difference in this technology between MA and TM. Probably MA health plans are just more efficient in taking care of these high-risk patients compared to traditional Medicare providers. Therefore, in order to empirically separate this kind of alternative hypothesis from our main hypothesis, and to empirically identify the reverse causalization practice, what we use is a policy shock from the Affordable Care Act. So in 2010, when the Affordable Care Act was passed, and large amount of money were basically taken away from the Medicare programs, which results in a significant reduction in this kind of MA capitation payment. And a more peculiar fact is that this kind of reduction in MA capitation payments is actually having an asymmetric impact on different type of patients, especially those patients with high risk score. Those sicker patients are actually receiving less money and have a deeper capitation payment cut compared to those relatively healthy and patients with no risk scores. And this kind of asymmetric impact of this ACA cut can actually help us to empirically separate the two alternative hypotheses from our main hypothesis and to empirically identify the reverse causalization practice. So to see how, first, let's just assume that this kind of negative associations is not caused by anything due to this kind of reverse causalization practice. And in this case, what we be expect is that after this ACA capitation payment cut, you will be observing a even more steeper lecture association compared to the before ACA level. Why? Because in the ACA cut, the sicker patients' capitation payments has been cutting much deeper compared to the low-risk patients' capitation payments. In this case, the MA health plan has even less incentive to spend on these high-risk patients, which you expect that to result in a even more steeper lecture association compared to the before ACA cut level. However, in the other scenario, if you believe that the lecture association is caused by something related to these reverse causalizations, actually you will have a different story. So indeed, it is correct that this kind of high-risk patient receive more capitation payment cut. However, this capitation payment for high-risk patient under this reverse causalization story are not used on this high-risk patient in the first place anyway. They are used to cross-subsidize these low-risk patients. Therefore, if you believe in this story, this kind of ACA capitation payment cut is actually going to affect this low-risk patient more, because this low-risk patient not only receive less capitation payment, they also receive less reverse causalizations. Therefore, our identification strategy can be basically summarized by these pictures. Basically, in order to empirically identify the reverse causalizations, basically we want to show that after the ACA cut, the lecture associations have been becoming more flattened compared to the before ACA level. And the one last thing we want to do here is that we want to randomly assign this ACA cut across otherwise similar patient group so that we can indeed make this kind of causal claims. And how do we be able to randomize this kind of ACA cut? So what we exploit is this staggered rollout of this ACA cut across US county during these ACA periods. Basically, what the government do is that they have a projected ACA cut for each county, and for those counties with higher number of projected ACA cut, they will face in this ACA cut in a much slower fashion, while those counties with lower projected ACA cut, they will face in this cut in a much faster fashion. And basically what we exploit from this paper is we exploit this policy determined cutoff and study the delta neighborhood around this cutoff to assign a treatment and control group, a study design similar to geographic regression discontinuous design in the literature to basically help us to randomize this ACA cut across different patient groups and obtain this treatment and control assignment. So with that, we can finally test our hypothesis. Basically, if you're expecting this lecture association to becoming more flattened after ACA cut, basically you are expecting this interaction term to have a different sign compared to these slope terms. Therefore, when they add them together, you will get the more flattened negative associations. Alternatively, if you expecting that this slope will become more steeper, so the negative associations have nothing to do with reverse causalizations, you will be expecting that this interaction terms to have the same sign as the slope term. So you have, when you add them together, you will have a more steeper negative associations. And in our final result, we are going to show here, basically we exploit different delta neighborhood around that $30 cutoff, and all of these different specifications gives us a consistent result, saying that this interaction term is indeed of the opposite side of these slope terms, which means that after the ACA cut, we indeed have a more flattened lective associations, which confirms our second hypothesis. So to sum up, in this paper, basically we empirically identify this overspending and underspending behavior in MA health plans through this kind of geographic regression discontinuous design, and provide the first evidence of reverse causalizations in healthcare. So so that's all. Thank you very much for listening. So if you have any questions, please ask me now or send email to my email address. I'm very much looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you. So yes, so that's my talk. So I think we will keep the Q&A session to the very end. So, and we will welcome our last speaker, Jackie Bake from MIT, to talk about fair exploration via axiomatic bargaining. So please start. Thank you.
All right, great. Thank you so much. So I'm Jackie. I'm a PhD student at MIT. I'm very excited to share with you this work with my advisor, Vivek Farias. So I don't need to emphasize to this group here that algorithmic fairness is an important problem, and sort of bias arising from algorithmic systems can have a huge impact on society. And so there's a large, vast literature, growing literature in this field of algorithmic fairness. And so the sort of typical setting that this literature studies is sort of the offline machine learning setting. But sort of the offline setting is somewhat constrained in that sort of how well your algorithm or how fair it can be is essentially a function of the training data. And so, one way to kind of bypass this issue of being attached to the data set is essentially to use online learning, where you essentially kind of create your own data set as you go along. And so it is well known that, for example, in a bandit scenario, if you use these exploration-based policy and you get to control the data generating process, you'll eventually converge to the optimal policy. And often optimal is often what you want in fairness. So to give you a concrete example, take the example of algorithmic hiring. So there's actually this very nice paper called Hiring as Exploration, and this is a paper actually in this conference, that show that if you use exploration, you can immensely improve both the diversity and the quality of your hiring rule compared to a kind of offline static machine learning model. And amazingly, they don't even explicitly incorporate fairness into their bandit model, because exploration sort of implicitly tries to give more opportunities to sort of historically disadvantaged groups. So my point here is that exploration can be a useful tool in algorithmic fairness. Obviously, it's not going to solve every algorithmic fairness problem, but it can be used as a useful tool. So in our work, what we study is actually fairness in exploration. So the question that we ask is actually, can the process of exploring be unfair? And of course, I'm going to make precise what I mean by unfair in a minute, but unfortunately, the answer to this question is yes, exploration can be unfair. And this type of bias arising from exploration has not been something that's well studied or well even identified prior to our work. So essentially, kind of a high level idea or message of our work is that naive exploration strategies can lead to unintended disparities. So we have to be very careful in designing our exploration strategies in certain online learning scenarios. So now let's get to sort of the main idea of our work, and I'm going to display, illustrate this idea through a case study that we did on warfarin dosing. So warfarin is a drug. It is a blood thinner whose optimal dosage varies highly across patients. So we're going to tackle the problem of learning the optimal personalized dosage of warfarin, and we're setting this up as an online learning problem. And so, since this is a short talk, I'm not going to go through the details of the model or the exact simulation setup. So I want to kind of display the main ideas without getting too bogged down in the details. But essentially, we use a warfarin data set, and we create a bandit instance off of this data set. And we simply run a bandit policy. And I'm just going to show you the results from this bandit policy. So in this data set, the patients, we have many covariates on them, and we're going to group the patients into groups. And I'm going to group these patients based on race. And so the results from this bandit, I'm showing you group regret, which is the regret incurred by each group. So there's two groups here, and group regret, you can think of it as sort of the number of mistakes that the policies made on patients of this group. So essentially sort of higher regret means sort of worse outcome for that group because there were more mistakes. And these numbers are normalized to account for like the prevalence of the group. So why is regret even incurred? It's effectively due to exploration. The policy needs to kind of try all different actions and to eventually learn what's the best action. So exploration is what's causing regret. And note that exploration is something that's shared across groups because there's sort of cross-learning across groups. So this is a contextual bandit model where there's cross-learning. So essentially exploring for one group actually benefits another group. And so the question that I'm going to ask is this a fair outcome? More specifically, is each group taking on their fair share of exploration? And so even though group B has much higher regret than group A, I claim that the answer to this question is unclear from looking at these numbers. Because what if it's the case that patients of group B are innately harder to learn than patients of group A? Then it makes sense that group B would have more regret than group A. So for example, when would this occur? Maybe patients of group A are completely homogeneous. They all have the same context. Then it's very easy to learn what we only have to learn one thing, the optimal dose for one type of patient. And so since I didn't really tell you about how the contexts were distributed between the groups, it's unclear whether this is a fair outcome or not. So to address this issue of sort of innate hardness, we want to understand sort of how much cross-learning is there between the groups. And we're going to consider the hypothetical scenario where there's no cross-learning across the groups. So we're going to consider the scenario where each group is on their own and they have to explore on their own. So they can't rely on the other group to do the exploration for them. So we evaluate this hypothetical scenario, and here are the results that we get. So we see that when the groups are on their own, the regrets incurred are 74 and 78 respectively for the two groups. So these numbers are very similar, which means that it's not the case that group B is innately much harder to learn than group A. But when the groups are together, group B ends up taking sort of more of the exploration, and group A benefits a lot from group B, and group B benefits sort of slightly from group A. So so now I want to essentially formally define fairness with respect to this example, and I'm going to do this by plotting these points on a graph. So essentially the two axes represent the two groups, group A and group B, and I'm plotting negative regret. So regret is something that's bad, so negative regret is something that's good. So it's better in this direction. So the purple point is the outcome that we got, which is the negative of the outcome that we got. And the blue point is the hypothetical scenario when groups are on their own. And so let me just redraw the lines of the axis so it looks like this. And the reason why I'm doing this is because I want to treat the blue point as a reference point. And I'm going to measure all outcomes with respect to the blue point. So essentially this red line represents the utility gained by group A. So essentially how much did group A benefit from the presence of group B? And similarly, this vertical line is group B's utility gain. And I'm going to just redefine the origin as the blue point. And this is what we call the disagreement point. So this is the point when the two groups don't sort of cooperate and exploration is not shared between the groups. And now the two axes represent utility gain, and the purple point is now the difference between the two groups. So we're back in the positive orthant again. Okay, so now we're going to define fairness with respect to these utility gains. So we still have this purple point, but whether this is a good outcome or not depends on what other outcomes are feasible. Because if we ran another bandit model or bandit policy, we would essentially get another point on this in this plot. So that's what we first have to understand. So for example, maybe the set of all feasible outcomes looks like this shaded region. So we'll assume for now that we know what this feasible outcome space looks like. And then we have the question, okay, well, out of these feasible outcomes, what is the sort of the most fair outcome? Is the purple point the most fair outcome? And the way that we're going to define fairness is we're going to go back to foundational economics. We're not going to sort of reinvent the wheel in terms of defining fairness. We're going to use the axiomatic bargaining framework. And so what this is we state a set of axioms that we believe a fair solution should satisfy. So I'm not going to go through these axioms, but for example, Pareto optimality is clearly a desirable property of a fair solution. And we simply define a solution to be fair if it satisfies these axioms. And so these are kind of fundamental axioms from the welfare economics literature. And the seminal work of Nash showed that if you want to satisfy these axioms, there's actually only a unique solution. And it is the solution that maximizes the sum of the logs of the utility gains, or equivalently maximizes the product of the utility gains. And this is what's called the Nash solution, or the proportionally fair solution. So this is how we're going to define fairness with respect to our bandit model. So essentially in the feasible region that we had, that shaded region, the unique fair solution is the point that maximizes the sum of logs of utility gains. Okay, so now we have our fairness definition, and now I'm going to spend the next remaining 5 minutes of this talk going through these, answering these natural questions that arise from our model. So the first question is, how fair are regret optimal policies? And the reason why we ask this question is because the bandit literature is very good at coming up with algorithms that are that minimize regret, right? But so these algorithms, how well do they do in terms of fairness? And so the answer to this question is that regret optimal policies are unfair. And just to give you a high level idea of what I mean by unfair, when you run a regret optimal policy, it turns out that one group ends up incurring the entire burden of exploration. And specifically, this group is the group with the worst best option. So basically their best option is the worst. And so to give you some intuition on why this is the case, essentially this group incurs the least regret from exploration because their other options are also bad, right? So they have a bunch of options, but all of them are bad. So they kind of incur the least regret from exploring. So essentially any algorithm that tries to minimize regret will take the most advantage of this group and try to do exploration on this group because they don't incur that much regret. But they end up incurring all of the regret because it's the most efficient to explore with this group. Okay, so essentially the first question says that we can't use a regret optimal policy. So then the next natural question is, okay, then what is a fair policy? Is there a policy that achieves the Nash solution? And so I won't go into details of how we derive this policy, but essentially the first thing we need to do is that we actually need to characterize this feasible utility set. And so we do this. I won't go into details of how we do this, but essentially we can construct this set, write this set big U, which characterizes exactly this shaded region. And note that big U is a function of theta, which is the unknown bandit parameter. So essentially, we want to find the solution that maximizes the sum of the logs over this utility set. But the first problem we run into if we want to do this is that we don't know theta because theta is the unknown parameter of the bandit problem. So what our policy does is we solve this optimization problem using an empirical estimate of theta at every time step, and we sort of follow this solution. And we essentially prove that this policy, the utilities induced by this policy achieve the Nash solution in this problem, sort of in the asymptotic regime. Okay, so we have a fair policy now. And the last natural question is, how does this policy do in terms of total utility? So do we lose a lot in terms of total efficiency when we use the fair solution compared to a system optimal solution? And so the short answer to this question is that the price of fairness is small. So the price of fairness is defined as the percent of total utility that's lost compared to the outcome that maximizes total utility. So basically a smaller price of fairness is better. So we show one theoretical result, which is a worst case result. And it says that the price of fairness is at most 1 minus 1 over square root of G, where G is the number of groups. So if G is small, which it usually is, the number of groups, then this worst case bound is also small. But also we run some simulations where we sort of generate random instances to get a sense of what the average price of fairness is, not just in the worst case. And in our simulations, the price of fairness is always very small. So sort of for randomly generated instances, it's usually on the order of 10% or less, even for a large G. So essentially, we believe that sort of we can tighten this theoretical guarantee, and it's not necessarily tight for our set of, for our problem. Okay, so those are the three main questions that our paper answers, and obviously I didn't go into them in detail. But okay, so last thing, I just want to go back to the warfarin example and tell you what happens when we run this fair policy. So this is the point that we had before, which is the regret optimal, and this policy was the regret optimal solution, actually, the regret optimal policy. The fair policy that we get is here. So essentially the utility gain for group B increases while the utility gain for group A decreases. So the utilities kind of balance out between the groups. And the price of fairness is actually small because the total utilities are actually very similar across these two outcomes. Okay, so I think I'm out of time. Thank you so much for listening. I'm happy to take questions over email or offline. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you very much, Jackie, for this wonderful talk. And yeah, so and our next speaker will be Lazi Summers from LBS and also now assistant professor in Buchan University. And she'll be talking about a shared service delivery from evidence from a few experiments. So please go ahead. Thank you.
Hello, thank you. Thank you so much for the introduction. You can see my screen, right? Is it okay now? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, thank you. Hello, everyone. I'm Nazlı Sönmez. I recently started working as an assistant professor at Bilkent University in Turkey, and I'm a former PhD student at London Business School. Today, I will talk about my work on shared service deliveries by focusing on a shared medical appointment setting. And this is a joint work with my former advisor, Kamalini Ramdas from LBS and Ryan Boyle from Harvard Business School. Before we start, I just want you to think your last doctor appointment, and it must have been one-on-one as we see here in this picture, and you may have received one-on-one attention during your diagnosis and prescription while there was no one else in the room, only you and the doctor. However, there is an alternative for that, which is called shared medical appointments. As you can see from this picture, there can be 5 to 15 patients, other patients, who are suffering from similar diseases with you. And they can also listen while you are getting your examination, getting your prescription and diagnosis, which is done by one-on-one interaction with the doctor, while others are also existing in the room. So you can just share some ideas with these people in the room. You can discuss some issues together, share your experiences. And in the end, maybe you can become friends with these people and come to your appointments together, or just chat about your disease in the later stages of the appointment. And shared medical appointments is a kind of shared service delivery. And we are also very familiar with other kind of shared service deliveries, which are similar to shared medical appointments. For example, conferences are typical exampons of a shared service delivery. I wish we had a chance to also sit in the same room and interact this time, but normally in a conference, we don't only learn from the presenter, we learn from each other, because sometimes there's a contribution from our peers and we create collective knowledge together in the same room. Similarly, in the classroom, we learn from professors, teachers, and also from the peers. And again, there is a collective knowledge created together in the same room. And there are already some theories in psychology and sociology stating that due to Koehler effect, people work harder in the group settings compared to being alone in what they are doing. And there is a famous sociologist, Randall, and his theory about group interaction rituals, saying that if there is a successful group interaction in any setting, it creates collective happiness and mutual focus. And operational transparency literature also shows that if you have a chance to see how service provider is behaving towards other people in the room, in your service setting, you are happier and you are more engaged in your service. So all these theories are saying that you can make customers more active rather than being passive by applying a shared service delivery. On the other hand, there are some beliefs and just like arguments stating that there can be loss of personal connection, there can be diminished confidentiality in shared service deliveries because there can be a privacy barrier. All these things are understandable, all these theories, pluses and minuses about shared service deliveries and its relationship with a customer engagement. So to explore this trade-off, we decided to conduct a field experiment with in a hospital setting, which is more conservative and hard to apply this setting. So we decided to do this to test the efficacy of shared medical appointments as a type of shared service delivery as a lever for increasing the patient engagement. And to be able to do that, we decided to do a randomized control trial with 1,000 glaucoma patients. Shared medical appointment idea is actually existing for more than 10 years, and it's applied by some hospitals in US. However, the existing studies are generally medical studies, and they are more observational type of studies. So as you can expect it, they generally suffer from some selection problem. Patients are just like choosing themselves to join shared medical appointments. So to provide some rigorous evidence on the benefits of this method, we decided to conduct a perfectly randomized control trial with 1,000 patients. And we conducted our study in southeast of India in a city called Pondicherry here, and with an hospital called Aravind Eye Hospital. Aravind Eye Hospital is world's largest blindness prevention care center, and it has 11 branches across all south of India. And we work with their Pondicherry branch, glaucoma clinic, and glaucoma volume of Aravind Eye Hospital is huge. They have 1,000 glaucoma visits per week. So their huge volume help us a lot for assembling our groups and also scheduling the later stages of the appointment, as I will discuss now. Let me just show you our design, how we conducted our randomized control trial with this time limit. So in our study, after getting an informed consent from a patient, we randomly assigned half of our study patients to one-on-one condition, half of them to the shared medical appointment condition. If a patient was assigned to a shared medical appointment condition, he had to continue with 3 more shared medical appointments, and which are 4 months apart from each other. And if a patient was assigned to one-on-one, similarly, he or she needs to continue with 3 more one-on-one appointments, which are 4 months apart from each other. And with this study, we measured how engaged our patients during each of their appointments by looking into their total speaking behavior, questions per minute, or just their answers, their non-question comments, and also some non-verbal engagement measures by looking at their gestures, mimics, and how they behave during the appointment. Before going into that, we also measured some different outcomes, such as patient knowledge, satisfaction, compliance, and also lateness of those patients. Because of that, we decided to use a multi-stage trial instead of just observing one appointment of the patients, because as you can expect, some of the behavioral outcomes takes long time to observe. And as a result of this study, we conducted our data collection process for 3.5 years. So my PhD was full of this data collection process and trips to Pondicherry, India. So this is a struct. If you just want to imagine how a shared medical appointment versus one-on-one appointment looks like in our study, this is the just visual version of shared medical appointment. It starts with an introduction period where everyone is welcomed and sit themselves in the same room. And then there is one individual examination of the first patient, and a patient comes in front of the doctor while others are again sitting in the room, and just like he or she gets individual examination, and doctor asks about compliance behavior or family history after that, because glaucoma is a hereditary disease. Then doctor just goes to next patient, and next patient comes in front of the doctor. After all individual examinations are done, there is a group interaction stage, which is this one, and a patient poses a question or a doctor says something. So there is basically a group discussion at the end of a shared medical appointment. And similarly, in one-on-one, there is an introduction stage. This is the picture of 5 consecutive one-on-one appointments. So this is one-on-one. There is only one doctor and one patient in the room. And it starts with introduction. There is again individual examination. It is exactly the same with individual examination part of shared medical appointments in terms of the content. And in the end, there is also a post-examination interaction where a patient can pose a question and doctor answers. And then there is a change over time because first patient leaves the room, then the second patient comes. So 5 consecutive appointments, one-on-one appointments looks like this, versus there is shared medical appointment in our study. If you are assigned to that arm, you are going to shared medical appointment. And one interesting thing is here is our shared medical appointments took longer than one-on-one appointments. If you think about the total duration of five patient shared medical appointments versus consecutive one-on-one appointments of 5 patients. And this is not the case in US because, as you can imagine, they are also used by time saving or cost saving in the US in some hospitals, such as Cleveland Clinic, Cooper Hospital. The reason for our result was because of the fact that Aravind Eye Hospital is more patient-centered, and they are trying to give the importance of just like their importance is health of the patients. So as a regular practice, they are not giving certain duration for their medical appointments. They are just giving a day to the patients. So, and then they finish the appointment when the discussion is over. So we didn't want to change their regular practice, and we did want to just apply what they are doing to be consistent with in our study. So in shared medical appointments, discussions were longer, and then they stopped, I think, later stages of the appointment. During our study, we had a chance to videotape all one-on-one and shared medical appointments in our study. So it provided us 20,000 minutes of video, which is a very rich data set we had. And we worked with a transcription agency so that we got the English transcripts of all these appointments with some timestamps and gestures and mimics. So when we got that data about verbal engagement, we first looked into a cumulative number of questions asked by a group of 5 patients in SMA versus one-on-one. And we saw that after some point, the red line shows the shared medical appointment. Shared medical appointment patients are asking more questions than one-on-one appointment patients, as you see here. And even if you truncate it, even if you stop shared medical appointments at mean duration of 5 consecutive one-on-one appointments, shared medical appointments produced more questions. So this is just giving some clues about the promise of the shared medical appointments about making appointments more patient-centered, and patients are asking more questions. And in terms of nonverbal patient engagement, we also collected some data from the transcription service about how attentive patients are, how positive, to what extent they are doing head wobbling, which is talai talatam in Tamil language. And in India, it represents appreciation, approval as a gesture. So we looked into eye contact, leaning in, end of appointment happiness. And this is the example sheet we got from the transcription service. And as a result, when we looked into the verbal engagement data, we found that in shared medical appointments, patients are talking more, they are asking more questions, 37% more questions, and they are making more non-question comments, and they are answering more questions. And we were also interested in the moderating effect of the examination order of the patients on different verbal engagement measures. And we saw that if the patients are earlier at the examination stage, they are more talkative, they are talking more, they are asking more questions compared to, again, one-on-one appointment patients. And this trend is similar in verbal engagement measures we see here. We also saw that from doctors' engagement level, actually, doctors are speaking more in shared medical appointments, and they are asking 3% fewer questions while making 11% more non-question comments and answering 38% more questions on a minute-by-minute basis. So overall, with the previous picture and these results, we can still see that the appointments are more patient-centered in shared medical appointments, and patients are more willing to ask questions. They are willing to learn something instead of just replying to what doctor is saying. So this is promising. And when we looked into the nonverbal engagement measures, we also saw that patients are more attentive, more positive, doing more head wobbling, doing more eye contact, and also they are happier at the end of the appointment in shared medical appointments compared to one-on-one appointments. Then, to conclude, I can just say that shared medical appointments are definitely a powerful way to improve both verbal and nonverbal engagement of the patients. And in our randomized control trial, by randomly assigning patients to experience shared medical appointments, we saw that they participated more in conversations, asked more questions, made more non-question comments, and they provided more answers to the questions asked by the doctor. And they exhibited higher nonverbal engagement levels. In addition to that, doctors who experienced shared medical appointment asked fewer questions and they answered more questions. So our results are actually not limited with patient engagement from this study. In a separate paper, we are showing that we decreased the non-compliance rate of the patients by 40% by doing shared medical appointments. And we are believing that to the extent this method is working to increase patient engagement and different patient outcomes, it can also work in other service settings where shared delivery is applicable and beneficial, and where customers can learn from each other and share similar concerns. And I just want to conclude with just like exciting news about our study. There are a couple of HBS MBA students who got inspired from our study, and they started a startup, and they recently got a very good amount of funding. And their name is Seventh Starling, and they are providing prenatal care and postpartum care in a shared appointment setting in a virtual environment. So they started their company during the COVID, but now they are still continuing doing virtual service. And yeah, they're going very well. And the final news is Dr. Soumya Swaminathan, who is the World Health Organization's chief scientist. She recently visited Aravind Eye Hospital, and she highlighted the importance of this kind of shared service delivery methods in healthcare and how they can help to just like solve the problem of supply and demand in developing countries, and how it will help the healthcare system of the developing countries overall. That's all I want to say. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you very much for the wonderful talk. So, if you have any questions, so our speaker, I think, will be in the gather town for a while, so you can catch them in the gather town and ask them questions directly there. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Xiaowei. That was the end of the session, correct?
Yes.
Very good, thank you. Up next is the session on COVID-19. We're gonna have talks on testing, on detecting clusters, vaccine prioritization, and other topics. And here to chair the session is Brian Wilder. Brian, are you here?
Hello, yes I am.
Okay, very good. All right, take it over.
Okay, wonderful. Yeah, so we have a set of 2 long talks and one short talk here on topics related somehow to surveillance and testing and containment for COVID-19. So let's see. So the first talk is going to be on Health Sentinel, a mobile crowdsourcing platform for self-reported surveys that provides early detection of COVID-19 clusters in San Luis Potosi, Mexico. Let's see. So it's one of the authors ready. Hey. Francisco, are you presenting this one? Okay, awesome.
Yep. Let me just set this up.
Okay, and while you're doing that, so note for all the authors in the session, I'll hold up a sign with a 1-minute warning when you're 1 minute away from the end of your kind of 14-minute window for the talk. And so if you pin my video in Zoom, then you'll be sure to see that.
I think I've pinned your video, and let me see if okay. Okay, can everyone see my screen?
Yes, we can see you. Take it away.
Okay, so hi everyone, thank you for having me. I'm here to talk about Health Sentinel, which is a mobile crowdsourcing platform for self-reported surveys that provides early detection of COVID clusters. And this is again at the beginning of the pandemic in San Luis Potosi, a state in Mexico. And as is kind of characteristic of research within this conference and this broader research community, it was a large project undertaken by multiple entities, a very interinstitutional project with both academic institutions such as the Potosinian Institute of Science and Technology, but also the Autonomous University of San Luis Potosí, as well as government institutions such as the Secretary of Health of the state and the Commission of Protection Against Sanitary Risks. And so just a brief overview of the talk. I'll begin by giving a bit of context with regards to how the Health Sentinel, and I'll often be using the acronym in Spanish for Health Sentinel, which is CDS. So how the CDS came about. And this is in the context of the beginning of the pandemic in San Luis Potosí. And then I'll talk a bit more about the methodology that the CDS undertook and mention some of the results and how at the early stages of the pandemic, the tool ended up being a useful way of inferring clusters before they happened or before they were verified with the extremely limited resources to verify actual outbreaks in the state. And I'll reflect a little bit on this entire process or the environment that gave rise to this collaboration between research and policy, while also giving some future directions and current and future directions that we're undertaking beyond this initial scope of the project, which we've studied for now. And so just some initial context. So some context on San Luis Potosí, my home state. It's located in central Mexico, and it's a medium-sized state population-wise of the country, with a population of roughly 2.8 million individuals, split into 4 different areas of the state: of the Altiplano area, Centro, where San Luis Potosí, the capital city, is, and ending with the Huasteca region, which is a more jungle region with higher presence of indigenous communities. And the capital of San Luis Potosí is a population of roughly 1.2 million, where the bulk of the focus of the study will be in the capital of San Luis Potosí, in the metropolitan area. And to give some context on the early pandemic in San Luis, the temporal scope of the study is what is now actually eons ago in COVID time, but is from March to August 2020, where the platform that I'll get into more detail soon collected information, and we studied the platform data from the scope of April to August of that year. And in Mexico, although there had been confirmed cases for as late as February, a nationwide health emergency wasn't declared until April. And at this time of this study, there had been roughly 650,000 confirmed COVID cases, 450,000 recoveries, and roughly 70,000 deaths, which gave rise to and the key parts here being the final 2 bullet points of this list, that the case fatality ratio at the time was very high for Mexico, 10%, the second highest in the world, and there was an extremely low testing rate. This has gotten marginally better over time, but nonetheless, this is a salient feature of what gave rise to this study, that roughly 0.4 qPCR tests were given for every 1,000 inhabitants of the country. And San Luis Potosí as a state did not fare much differently from these overall nationwide aggregates. And again, these final 2 points point to huge limitations in epidemiological surveillance of the population. And it's in this resource-limited context that the initial groundwork to the CDS was created through what is called the VIRUS program. And this is a program that was spearheaded by the Autonomous University of San Luis Potosí, their School of Medicine, one of the foremost schools of medicine in Mexico. And it stands for the surveillance of respiratory infection and creation of health units. And emphasis actually on the creation of health units, as I'll get into in a while longer. And this interventional model inspired by the UN as a methodology is to face COVID with the creation of these health units focused on reducing risks of biological agents in specifically vulnerable communities. And I mentioned this because at the beginning, there was also an express focus on the Huasteca region of San Luis Potosí, this jungle area with a larger concentration relatively of indigenous communities in the state. And part of the VIRUS program is that it was focused on collective community actions to address pandemic. And there was an accumulated risk approach. And all of this, the key tool in this accumulated risk approach was a multimodal vulnerability index that was created by epidemiologists and local doctors to roughly correlate with specific incident or the risk that an individual has at a moment of time for respiratory infection, and not necessarily COVID. And 4 key elements that influence the vulnerability index are the comorbidities, access to health services that an individual might have, economic status of individuals, and other co-threats of the chemical, physical, and biological kind. And originally this vulnerability index through task forces from the Autonomous University of San Luis Potosi's medical school was implemented at a community level at different regions around San Luis Potosi. But ultimately, this entire project, and the key point to take from all of this, is that this was right before the creation of the CDS, and there was already this existing environment of fruitful collaboration between policy. And in all this, I failed to mention that a large portion, a key pillar of this virus program, in addition to the UASLP, was the Secretary of Health of San Luis Potosi, known by SSSLP. And so already there was this confluence of policy and practice prior to the creation of the CDS. And so the Sentinel de la Salud, the Health Sentinel, is a part of this community-based health system for the virus program. And it integrates mobile technology in the form of an app for Android phones for COVID-19 triage that implements this survey that I mentioned. And we'll go a little bit more into the details of the actual survey and risk levels to assess at the individual level, the risk level of users of the application. And at the same time, it obtains geographical information of where the responses to the survey are being made. And so on one end, it gives users the risk level that they have under the virus approach methodology. And this also provides a way of filtering key public health information to users as a function of the risk level that they have given the response to the platform. And ultimately, the core components of the system are a backend for the logic and data flow control, the mobile app that I mentioned, and also this front end that provides a funnel of this public health information, and also some geographic information on different risk levels across the state. And all this information, of course, is maintained privately in a supercomputing center that exists at the EPCIT under compliance with the highest standards of Mexican law. And so now we can go into a little bit more of the details behind the actual survey and the methodology of the CDS. So the Health Sentinel survey at a first level elicits general information on ethnicity, and this importantly elicits information on whether an individual pertains to an indigenous community or not, occupation, what form of health services that an individual might use, the home environment being the number of individuals in a home, and baseline protection in terms of sanitary actions that an individual might take, as well as a support network. And this is a key social component that was important during the initial cases of the viral spread. You can think about this, whether an individual can self-isolate or not, or they have a support network or not. And in addition to this, the risk survey, which is in this table on the left, had questions, 8 main questions on 3 different categories that focused on contact factors, whether individuals had contact or had been outside of the state in a certain amount of time, in signs and symptoms of respiratory illness, and the potential risks or comorbidity factors that the individual might have. And as a function of these questions and the answers, on the right-hand side, we have the actual risk level assigned. And this is the function that was created by our medical team and our epidemiological team as a way of triage and as a way of filtering public health messages, again, in the early stages of the pandemic. And the front end of the users of the app looked something like this, where you have, this is actually the San Luis metropolitan area, and there are instances of different risk indices in different locations and quantities that a user can see. And the interesting collaboration here with the public health authorities was that actually we obtained access to retroactively understand how this compared to the tests that were actually done for qPCR in this initial period of the pandemic. And in these initial months, remember I mentioned there was very limited testing. There were roughly 10,000 tests that were administered in these initial months of the pandemic. And we split our study into 2 epochs, the first being from April to May, and the rest from April to the end of July, the full duration of tests that we obtained. And of these 10,000 tests, roughly 9,500 had known postal addresses that we could correlate a specific geolocation to. And the tests also included demographics, date when symptoms started, and when the diagnosis was confirmed. And from this, we can extrapolate several actual clusters of COVID that had happened during the study period. And so the key statistical question that we're looking at is based on the fact that, like influenza, COVID-19 spreads in clusters. And on the left, we see, and we'll delve more into the visualization of the data that we obtained over the course of these 4 months. But the statistical questions that we ask ourselves are, first of all, are the data points homogeneously distributed? And again, this is going back to trying to find clusters in the first place. And if not homogeneously distributed, then can we at least, are they distributed according to the population density or some other distribution that might represent the inherent bias in the responses that we might see from the app in the first place? And beyond this, once we see whether this is the case or isn't, we can see if there are statistically significant clusters and if they persist over time. And so with these questions in mind, we can go into the results and what we saw over these 4 months of initial data. And well, the first kind of core overall participation results is that we had roughly 1,500 responses of the survey of the app in this initial stages of the pandemic, roughly split halfway through men and women. And with, again, we have this bias of a younger age of responses. Roughly the average age of responses is around 33 years old. And here we can see the frequencies of the responses of the different levels of risk that were categorized according to the function specified by the virus program and the Secretary of Health of the state. And what the first salient feature of this is, of course, that the bulk majority of cases are of the no risk category of the multiple different risk categories that we can have, roughly 78%. And then the remaining 20% are split throughout the lower to extremely high risk categories of the survey answers. And again, I present this here, but I refer all of you, in case you're interested, to more nuanced information to the full version of the paper, which we have online. But and here are some visualizations of the answers of the risk categorizations that we saw across AGBs. And the AGBs are the most basic unit of statistical measurement under the national body of statistical measurements of Mexico, the INEGI. And so these images from the top left is no risk, B is from A to F are an increasing risk, and we can see here the relative densities of responses that are of increasing risk as we go from A to F. And we see that there are seemingly different biases in terms of where the risk cases are over the course of the 4-month period of the study. And so to make a more nuanced spatial point analysis, we used 3 main techniques. Well, at a first level was simply looking at a kernel density estimation of the frequency of cases we saw at different risk levels, treating it as a point process. And from this, we could see empirical epicenters for different bandwidths of the kernel. And eventually, we also looked at more descriptive statistics of the point process in the form of K and L functions that allow us to see at different spatial scales whether there is clustering or dispersion, and also allows us to filter over specific locations and see where there can be empirical clusters in the data. And ultimately, this gives us the cluster detection that as we'll see actually correlated with cases that were verified under the information given by the Secretary of Health. And so the first technique is that of density estimation. And here is of all the contributions that we have. And here is of no risk responses that we have in our survey. And as we can see, the epicenter of the risk responses in different locations across the metropolitan area. Now, for the spatial analysis, we look at Ripley's K and L functions, which, not to delve into too many details, is just simply quantifying at different spatial scales how much the empirical distribution of the point process we see deviates from being either homogeneous or, in this case, comparable to some baseline distribution that governs the point process. And the baseline distribution that we used was that of the population density to account for a certain amount of the bias in responses that we got. And the way that we visualize the K and L functions is through these graphs as on the right-hand side, where this essentially counts at a given spatial scale the points that occur at a given distance from each other. That's the x-axis is the distance that can be modulated. And these bands are under MCMC empirical runs of the baseline point process, where we expect the clustering we expect some clustering to occur naturally. And when we see significant deviations of this graph above these bands is when we actually say that we can empirically witness some clustering with high probability. And
Francisco, sorry to interject, but we're coming to the end of the time for this talk.
Okay,
thanks.
Perfect. By the way, I'll tell you in a sec, actually, it's blurry when you hold the sign up because your background is blurry. I don't know if it was like 5 minutes or if it was actually the end. And so then we modulating different, the different spatial scales, we can see different clusters. And these clusters are consistent with specific places of outbreaks, such as Tequis, Mercantile neighborhood in San Luis Potosi. And so the final key takeaways is that there is strong correlation between these verified cases. And this is a potential useful predictive tool in early stages of the pandemic when there are very few resources. And we're in current iterations of including this form of triage with other diseases that can occur naturally in winter months of the pandemic. And I think we've run out of time to talk about some of our experiences of bridging policy and practice, but I mentioned the important points being of the existing collaborative atmosphere and the ease of communication that we had with policymakers. And finally, just some future steps. We have data that we're analyzing from this past year, and we're turning this into a tool that can inform policy in real time for other forms of resource allocation as well. And hopefully we can inform vaccination campaigns and extend the functionality of this tool as a public health communication tool. Again, focusing on community-based approaches as in the spirit of the virus program. Thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please feel free to find me in Gather or shoot me an email.
Thank you, Francisco. Yeah, really interesting talk. Yeah, I think just for the sake of sort of staying on schedule, we'll move to the next talk here, but please find Francisco if you have questions. So the next talk will be given by Scott Rodowitz on fair dynamic rationing. So Scott, if you want to get the screen share set up here.
I think I need Francisco to stop sharing before I can get started. Perfect.
And yeah, so I'll attempt to sort out whatever was making the sign blurry, but this is intended to be a 1 minute left sign.
All right. Hold on 1 second, sorry. All right. I'm assuming everyone can see this. If you can't, stop me. Otherwise, we'll get going. So my name's Scott Rodowitz. I'm currently a postdoc at Stanford's Graduate School of Business. I'm going to be talking about fair dynamic rationing, which is joint work with Vahida Manshade and Rodney Azada. I should say, first off, big thank you to the organizers and session chair and all the other presenters. It's really exciting to be a part of this first inaugural EAAMO conference. So I'm happy to be here, and thanks all of you for attending. So I'm going to start things off by introducing a general class of allocation problems before getting into a little bit how this relates to the topic of the session. So suppose you as a social planner have been tasked with allocating some desirable social good to agents who are going to arrive sequentially. When they arrive, you'll observe their need, and you're going to need to make an allocation decision at that time. Now, these needs might be arbitrarily correlated, so that you can have a pretty challenging scenario here. And let's think about what your goals might be. So suppose you want to be efficient. So you want to use as much of your supply as possible. Well, that's actually a pretty simple problem. You can just allocate on a first come, first served basis. You're going to use as much of your supply as you can. But the problem is that you might be very unfair to people who arrive later on in the process. You might run out of supply, and so whoever shows up last is probably not going to get it. And alternatively, let's say you want it to be very fair. You want to make sure everyone gets the same amount. Well, that's also pretty easy. Just don't give anyone everything. Don't give anyone anything. And in that case, everyone gets the same amount, but of course that's a silly solution as well. So in this talk, what we're going to do is think about balancing those two extremes, how we can achieve dual goals of efficiency and equity, at least to the greatest extent possible, when thinking about a sequential allocation problem. So this is a common dilemma faced by nonprofits and governmental agencies. And to motivate that, we can take a step back in time about 1.5 years ago to the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic in the US. So here you can see states are going to have outbreaks that are going to occur at different times, or at least they're predicted to occur at different times. The size of their peak outbreak is expected, of course, to be of different sizes. And so the needs that these states are going to have are unknown in advance. But they're, of course, also correlated. If things are pretty bad in the Northeast, it's not like it's then going to be smooth sailing for other states. There's network effects in the pandemic. If it's bad somewhere, it's presumably going to get bad in other places. So if you put yourself in the shoes of the Federal Emergency Management Agency, which had control of this federal stockpile of emergency medical supplies, you can think about this scenario in the cartoonish introductory example that I showed you. So to be precise, you can think about observing the need that New Jersey has for, say, ICU beds in this first week of April. And you need to make an immediate decision about how much of that need you should meet, knowing that next week, Connecticut is going to have significant need, and probably the week after, Tennessee is also going to have significant need. Now, you may know to some extent what the expected value of that need might be, but there's a lot of variance around those projections. And of course, there's correlation as well in these scenarios. So it's a pretty challenging question to ask about how FEMA should ration supplies both efficiently and equitably. And I want to take a moment and say that there's plenty of other examples in social good settings where these types of questions arise. So you can think about hurricanes that sequentially impact municipalities and the rationing of emergency response resources. You can think about mobile food pantries that sequentially visit agencies. Again, you have the same type of question where need is going to realize sequentially, and you need to make allocation decisions in the face of potentially complex correlation. All right, so this is our motivation. I want to introduce our general framework for studying these types of problems, including our model. So we're going to suppose that we have just one unit of supply. So we're normalizing this. It's divisible. And we have a sequence of agents that arrive. And when they do, we observe their demand. Up front, we know the joint distribution of their demand, which can have any sort of arbitrary correlation. Now, when an agent arrives, we need to immediately and irrevocably decide upon the allocation to give that agent. And each agent is going to care about their fill rate being the fraction of their demand which is met. Now, this fill rate is going to be some number between 0 and 1. Agents don't need more than what they ask for. And to balance equity and efficiency, our goal is going to be to maximize the minimum fill rate. So I put this idea of a minimum fill rate in quotes because it's somewhat poorly defined for the stochastic process. There's a few different ways we can think about taking expectations, and those correspond to two different objectives, two different notions of fairness. The first is this ex post minimum fill rate, which is about fairness in observed outcomes. And the second is the ex ante minimum fill rate, which is about fairness in expected outcomes. So we're going to care about both of these objectives, and we'll have results for each of them. All right, so that's our framework. I'm going to jump right into our main result. So in the paper, we design an adaptive policy which simultaneously achieves the best possible ex post and ex ante minimum fill rate guarantees. So said another way, no sequential policy can guarantee a better ex post or ex ante minimum fill rate. So not only do we have strong theoretical guarantees with our policy, which I'll introduce to you in a moment, it's also practically appealing. So our policy is computationally efficient and transparent. It requires minimal informational knowledge about this joint distribution F, and it naturally generalizes to a few other considerations. And these qualities, I should say, are particularly important in public sector settings, right? Transparency is often a chief objective of these social planners, people who are making allocation decisions. All right, so before introducing our policy, I'm going to start by considering a simpler setting, and that'll give us some intuition behind what is achievable as well as what our policy does. So suppose for a moment that we knew the entire demand sequence in advance. Suppose there was no stochasticity in demand. What would you do? I'll let you think about it for just a few seconds. All right, so if you thought about something like proportional allocation, you did a great job. What we want to do is equalize the fill rate for each agent, and then we want to raise that equal level as high as we can. And this is for both the ex post and the ex ante minimum fill rate. Now, if we do that, we get a minimum fill rate of either 1 or 1 over the total demand, whichever is smaller. And so that's what's achievable if demand was deterministic. Now, we're going to use this in our notion of a fairness guarantee. So to be precise, we're going to fix 2 parameters. We're going to fix mu, which is this expected total demand, right? Our supply is normalized to 1, so this can also be thought of as the demand to supply ratio in expectation. And we're going to fix the number of agents n. This is the number of decisions we need to make. And then we're going to say that a policy achieves an ex post fairness guarantee of kappa mu n if for any demand sequence with an expected total demand of mu and n agents, we can achieve a kappa fraction of what we would hope to achieve, or of what we could achieve if demand were deterministic. So this is saying, what's the cost of having this stochastic demand sequence? And we're going to try to design policies that have good guarantees on their ex post minimum fill rate and their ex ante fill rate. So for the remainder of this talk, I'm going to focus on this notion of ex post fairness. We do have analogous results for ex ante fairness. The ex post results are pretty emblematic of what we can say in the other case. All right, so I'll start with the bad news. So unfortunately, no sequential allocation policy can achieve an ex post fairness guarantee better than this surface for kappa. It's decreasing in the number of agents, as you might expect. The more decisions you have to make, the more challenging this problem becomes. And so we're not going to do any better than this parameterized surface. But in fact, we can achieve exactly this upper bound, and we can do so using a fairly simple adaptive policy. And that policy is called projected proportional allocation. It's based on the optimal policy if demand were deterministic. And so the way I want you to think about it is, well, what would you do if you knew what demand was going to be? You'd allocate proportionally, as we discussed. So because you don't know future demand, you can't do exactly that, but we'll do the next best thing, and we'll replace future demand with its expectation. So to be precise, we're going to take our first observed demand, we'll take our full initial supply of 1, and we'll allocate to this first agent proportionally to what we expect total demand to be in this 3-agent scenario. Then we'll observe the second demand, we'll take our remaining supply, and we'll allocate that proportionally, again, based on what we expect demand to be. Note that we're updating demand here based on every observation we've made so far. All right, so in the paper, we're able to show that this projected proportional allocation policy achieves exactly that ex post fairness guarantee of kappa that I showed you earlier. And we're able to show this by inductively establishing a lower bound on the value to go of our policy for any particular state. So I'm not going to get into the details here. Instead, I'm just going to highlight that this policy, as I've mentioned, is simple. It's transparent. It's pretty clear what's going on. It's easy to communicate to stakeholders. And it also requires fairly minimal distributional knowledge about this joint distribution. All we need to know are conditional first moments of each agent's demand. All right, so like I said, we have analogous results for ex ante fairness that I'm not going to get into today. Instead, I'm going to talk about these other properties. So our adaptive policy has these nice properties, but it's natural to wonder whether there's a simple non-adaptive policy that could do as well as what we achieve, and of course also have some nice properties for application in this public sector context. So to shed some light on this question, we considered a class of non-adaptive policies called target fill rate policies, which work by predetermining a threshold tau and then aiming for a fill rate of tau until supply runs out or until all of the agents have arrived. So you can think about optimizing over tau, in which case you get what we call the optimal target fill rate policy. And in the paper, we're able to exactly characterize the performance of this optimal TFR policy. So in all cases, it's strictly below the performance of the performance guarantee of our PPA policy. In some cases, it asymptotically approaches this guarantee. That occurs when there's a large number of agents and supply is quite scarce. In other cases, if there's not too many agents and supply is well matched to expected demand, there's a significant gap in the guarantee of our PPA policy and the guarantee of the optimal target fill rate policy. Now we're able to show this result via a connection to a constrained version of a single item monopoly pricing problem, which is a somewhat interesting technical result. I'd be happy to talk about it offline in the interest of time. Not going to get into the details here. Instead, I'm just going to offer a brief comparison between our policy and this optimal TFR policy. So both are pretty simple and fairly clear in terms of what they're accomplishing and how easy they are to explain. In their own ways, both require minimal distributional knowledge as well, right? We just need these first conditional moments for each agent's individual demand, whereas the optimal TFR policy requires full knowledge of the demand, but only the total demand distribution. All right, so with this all in mind, I want to take us back to this motivating case study of COVID-19, back to the topic of this session. And so we've built a case study using a demand model that was in place and was studied by the White House in April 2020. So we looked at projected need for ICU beds as a proxy for just overall demand for medical supplies. We partitioned states into 4 groups to make this setting pretty simple. Now, this demand model that we're using from the IHME doesn't have a full distribution. It just gave a few percentiles. So we put a normal distribution on top of this, and then we assumed various levels of correlation between these 4 groups. And we looked at results for 4 different levels of correlation. So there's a few different things I want to highlight for you here. First, our PPA policy significantly outperforms its theoretical guarantee. It also significantly outperforms an optimal TFR policy, especially in the presence of correlation, which should make sense. Our adaptive policy is going to have a big advantage in those types of settings. And it even compares reasonably well to a dynamic programming solution. So, right, this is a well-defined optimization problem. You can formulate a dynamic program. In many cases, that DP is going to be intractable. We made this fairly simple so that we could solve the DP. And even despite this, our policy is almost as fair as a dynamic programming solution. And of course, it's much simpler. It's much more transparent. It's not this black box, and you don't need full distributional information. So we think there's a lot of good reasons to use this pretty straightforward policy in practical settings. All right, so to sum up, I'm running out of time. What have we done? We looked at how to achieve dual goals of equity and efficiency when facing an arbitrarily correlated sequence of demand. And we've showed that all you need is a simple and transparent policy called projected proportional allocation. I encourage you to check out the paper with proof ideas as well as some extensions for this work. And thank you very much for your time, your interest, and your contributions to making this conference as exciting and fun as it is.
Brian, you're on mute.
Thanks. Yeah, well, thank you, Scott, for a really interesting talk. So I don't see any questions in the Q&A at the moment, but please go ahead and write in the Q&A or the chat if there's something that you'd like to ask. I think we have time for maybe one question. Well, something that I'm curious about here is, I mean, I think it's a really interesting property that the allocation rule that you propose requires such minimal distributional information. But even I think these conditional first moments, can be pretty difficult, right? Like, epidemic forecasting is really hard, right? And models have often been, pretty bad at predicting when exactly searches will happen. So how much robustness do you think there is to sort of, misestimation of those?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I'm going to defer giving you a full answer. It's something that we're working on right now, actually, to add to the paper. I would say that if there's model misspecification, it can definitely cause some problems. I would argue that it's going to cause generally less problems for this type of solution than a dynamic program, which is going to be very reliant on accurate demand distributional information.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Great question.
Well, thank you, Scott. So I see that there's a question in the Q&A, but I think in the interest of time, maybe we can take that like in the chat. But thanks again. Okay, so our next talk, Francisco, are you giving this one as well on So we have a talk on optimal testing and containment strategies for universities in Mexico amid COVID-19.
Yeah, so unfortunately, I mean, my colleague Edwin was going to give me this talk, but he's feeling under the weather today. So I'll present this.
Francisco, before you start, before we were getting maybe I think phone buzzing or something during your presentation, if you could move that.
Phone buzzing, strange.
Okay, sorry.
Okay. No, good to know. If I see a rogue phone, I will slay it. Great. So thank you for having me again. So now I've changed. So you can see I'm a different human being. I'm not Francisco Marmolejo 1, I'm Francisco Marmolejo 2. And I'll be talking about optimal testing and containment strategies for universities in Mexico. And so this is joint work with Luis Vázquez, Alonso Guzmán, Philip Lasos, Erwin Bloch, Jacob Jonerby, Roberto Tello, and Nina Rajgopal. And just as a brief overview, I'll talk about the specific testing mechanism that we've developed, which we've dubbed Test and Contain, with a guiding example that will really contain all of the nuts and bolts of what we propose and what we've implemented. And then just give some minor details on the model and assumptions that we use for the methodology that we have. And end by giving some reflections on what bridging research and practice has been for us in the Mexican context, as well as some potential future directions of work that we're exploring currently. And so this is a collaboration between colleagues from, well, when we were at Oxford, now we're in multiple other institutions, and multiple research institutes in Mexico, the EPC, the Autónoma de San Luis Potosí, and the Tecnológico de Monterrey. And so the main problem that we seek to tackle is that of accurate and extensive testing of the population. This has been a key tool for epidemiological surveillance, and as we've seen in previous talks, resources have been very limited. And this talk will focus on testing as a resource, but that isn't necessarily the only resource that can be constrained. We could also have trained personnel be a constraint, lab time, or the availability of vaccines. There are multiple options. And in this, we focus on simple COVID testing resources, qPCR testing reagents. And the question that we ask ourselves is, how can we help policymakers maximize the benefit of these limited resources? And in order to, well, as soon as we ask ourselves the question of maximizing the benefit of a resource, it's important to take a step back and internalize and try to think about what we mean. What are the objectives that we wish to satisfy with testing? And upon a certain thought, we identified two important objectives with that are to be satisfied by testing resources. The first being to minimize the propagation of the virus. And for this, we might potentially allocate some tests to individuals who are susceptible, some who might spread the virus, or maybe in a certain way to protect vulnerable segments of the population. But at the same time, we've seen that there's a blunt tool to control viral spread, which is self-isolation and lockdown. And another aspect of testing is that it can actually help minimize the impact of unnecessary self-isolation. It can be, if you find someone who's healthy, they can return to normalcy. And here we might want to prioritize essential workers or individuals without economic means to self-isolate. And again, this can be a tool in this setting to ease out of lockdown. And the main primitive that we use in our allocation strategies is that of group testing. And well, group testing, it's a paradigm of testing whereby with a single qPCR test, what you do in a group test is you might take multiple individuals, say 5 of them, for example. You take their samples and you mix their samples into one. And now you have a single qPCR test and you run the mixed sample under the qPCR testing kit. And in the simplest case, you get an answer either positive or negative. And in the group test, what does this mean? If the result is positive, this means that a single individual is sick. And if it's negative, then it means all the individuals in this group are healthy. And this is the potential to drastically reduce the number of tests that we need to tackle these objectives from before. And as a part of the interdisciplinary nature of this work, we've actually helped facilitate knowledge transfer of specific group testing techniques from Oxford to the Lambama laboratory at the EPC, National Laboratory for Agricultural and Environmental Biotechnology. And so just as a kind of a quick example of the potential benefits of group testing is actually the first group testing strategy of Dorfman, brought about in the 40s to combat syphilis. And for this, we have a population of size n, and it's a very simple two-stage process, where the first stage, we randomly create groups of a fixed size and test them. And in the second stage, we look at the groups that were positive and accordingly delve into those positive groups. So if we have a, if we have a picture, let's say that this is the population, these little boxes might be individual groups of a certain size, say size 5. And in the first stage, some of these might be positive group tests, some might be negative, and some might be positive. And that's the first stage of the process. In the second stage, we delve into the specifics of these positive tests and ascertain who precisely is infected within the population. Now, in this case, we can actually, if we have a certain infection rate, which is parametrized by the number of infected individuals in a population, then we can actually see what the optimal value of the initial buckets is, which is denoted by B in these equations. And so what's interesting is that at low infection rates, at high infection rates, nothing works, but at low infection rates, we get some significant savings over the baseline testing strategy where we test everyone in a population. Now, the thing though is we get some savings and we're able to perform some tests and know the incidence of, know who is infected and who isn't in a population. And there's a rich theory behind group testing. In fact, there are multiple papers in the learning theory literature on the subject on how we can establish who is infected and who isn't in a population with a minimal number of tests. And there are some lower bounds, information theoretic, that under which it's impossible to do so. And the question here is, what if we don't have enough tests for Dorfman? What if we have tests that are far below these lower bounds that we have for perfectly knowing who is and who isn't infected in a population? And so rather than beginning with this goal of knowing who is and who isn't infected, something's got to give. So if we relax actually precisely knowing the diagnosis on an individual level, we can reduce the number of tests that are required for our objectives from before, and we can get surprisingly simple mechanisms that yield improvements. And so let's go through an example scenario at a university, and this toy scenario will elucidate the methodology that we propose in Test and Contain. So that in this university, imagine that we have 10,000 individuals, and these 10,000 individuals of this toy scenario, 20 are academic staff, 480 are cafeteria workers, and we have 9,500 students. And the important thing to note in this toy example is that this university has two centers of contact, either in classrooms or in the cafeteria where all students congregate to have a meal and the cafeteria workers are there. So in this toy example, that's the contact reality. Now, this university only has 500 COVID tests at their disposal. That's it. And the functionality of group testing is there are biological limits to how many people can fit in a group. The Oxford Protocol is actually out of 10. So realistically speaking, we can only have at most 10 people in a group. So the question is, what is a good testing strategy? What do we do in this case? And the testing and containing mechanism that we propose is to, for simplicity, to put people in group tests that are disjoint across the population. And if a test is returned positive, then the individuals are told to self-isolate, or rather to not be at the school. And if it's negative, they're allowed to continue as normal. And again, this is a necessary evil of the fact that we have such few tests for the overall population. It could be the case that there's a healthy individual that happens to be in a positive test, but this is something that we accept given the budget constraints that we have. And we can measure the performance of a given allocation via 4 metrics. So the first is we can look at the expected number of critical COVID cases that are prevented in this testing and containment mechanism that we have. And the other 3 are actually, there are 3 very natural categories in our example: academic staff, cafeteria workers, and students. And these segments of the population, we can look at the per segment, how many people are isolating unnecessarily, how many people are healthy, but actually in a positive group. And so what might be a typical budget constraint practice? What happens much of the time in Mexico is that perhaps with this 500 tests, if one is conscious of academic staff, I might allocate 20 tests to that academic staff, perfectly know who is infected, who isn't amongst the professors. And for everyone else, if they're showing symptoms, test them. And unfortunately, these tests aren't very informative, and there's an inherent bias in the result. And what we'll see is actually many cases go unnoticed. So if we map the performance of this allocation, then we see that we don't catch very many cases. But at the same time, since we're performing tests of an individual size, we never have the scenario in which there's a healthy individual in a positive group test who is told to stay away from school unnecessarily. Now, okay, so now let's try to implement the functionality that we gained from group testing. So now let's say we have groups of size 10. Let's pick a random assignment of 500 disjoint groups of size 10 from the university and put these 500 groups of size 10 in groups and perform group tests on each of them. Now, the benefit of this is that we cover half of the population, and if done randomly, we can estimate the prevalence of the virus. But there are some drawbacks. It could be the case that a professor, for example, is in a group that is positive and is actually healthy. And if the university wants to place an emphasis on teaching on a given week, this is undesirable. Or it could also be the case that a cafeteria worker, which has contact with many students, is not within the 50% tested, and therefore might be a potential super spreader. And so again, if we map out the performance of this allocation, we see that we catch more cases, but at the same time, now we have some more unnecessary self-isolations. And this again is by virtue of the fact that we have larger group sizes in our testing allocation. Now, the strategy that we propose and what's actually implemented in what we've implemented with software is to look at essentially per segment allocating a different number of tests at different group sizes. And let's consider the case in which a potential testing strategy that we could have is 20 tests for individually testing academic staff, maybe 96 tests of group 5, which covers all 480 individuals of the cafeteria. And let's say that the remaining 384 tests we do of group size 10 for the rest of the population. Now, in this case, if you look at the performance, we catch more cases for the following reason, that we've covered the entire segment of cafeteria workers, which were potential super spreaders. And at the same time, given the fact that we have we've allocated 20 tests to professors, we have no unnecessary self-isolations of academic staff. Now, of the remaining tests, recall that we were doing group size 5 for cafeteria workers. So the chances of being a healthy person in an infected group are decreased, and we see that in the bar. And so we have the performance that we see here. Now, a potential tweak on this is, well, let's say that maybe for cafeteria workers, we allocate tests of group size 10 so that we only need 48 to cover all of them. And this frees up 48 other tests for students. Now, if we look at the performance, given the fact that we've freed up some more tests, we cover a larger segment of the population. Therefore, we prevent more potential critical cases of COVID. But what we see is we've actually paid a cost for this because now we have more unnecessary self-isolations amongst cafeteria workers. And so if you put the performance of all of these strategies side by side under these 4 metrics, then the first thing that is salient of all of this is that at least this top right allocation is dominated by these bottom 2 in the sense of Pareto dominance of this multi-objective problem. And so precisely this is precisely what our methodology does, is we look at specific parametric situation for a university and filter out solutions that are dominated by others to allow policymakers to put their own priorities of what they want to prioritize for their testing allocations on a given week. And so just some quick to talk about the model that we have. So we assume that there's a testing budget in a given population that's split into different categories. We had 3 categories before, where each of these categories has a different number of individuals, different baseline probability of infection. Think about this as the incidence of the virus in that segment of the population, and as differing levels of contact with other segments of the population. And a testing allocation in this case is just simply, again, per segment of the population, how many tests of what group size do you allocate? And these group tests will be disjoint. And so we have certain constraints that we want to respect. And we assume a single step of a very simple contagion model, where initially individuals are infected with an independent probability of infection as per the segment rules. And subsequently, the population is tested according to whatever strategy we have. And as a function of tests, the containment happens, and then further infection happens after the fact. And after this infection, we can measure we want to minimize the propagation of the virus and unnecessary self-isolation. So we measure and we can compute empirically. I invite you to take a look at the paper the expected number of cases that we prevent, as well as the per segment number of individuals that unnecessarily self-isolate in expectation. And we can look at Pareto dominance as a solution concept for this problem instance. And what we compute is the set of allocations that are the Pareto frontier, that aren't Pareto dominated by others. And these exemplify the trade-offs that policymakers might have in making a decision on testing allocations. And so just to end with bridging research and practice, we've been working with Mexican universities to actually implement this Pareto frontier exploration. And we have software to facilitate the computation of the Pareto front. And the Tec de Monterrey is actually using our software to compute and explore the Pareto front for their combined staff and population for over 96,000 individuals. And in the sake of time, I won't go into too many details on how they extrapolate relevant parameters for the model, but data is maintained in an anonymized fashion, and over 4 categories, we're able to help policymakers search within the Pareto frontier. And we essentially, the way that we do so is by clumping strategies that have similar performance with one another, so that ultimately policymakers can explore the tool with a convenient visualization, which is presented here. And just as an example of the amount of solutions that are filtered, we see roughly 99% of solutions filtered with the bucketing scheme before. But a critical factor of success has been working with local research councils. We've established trust with this sensitive data, and our team composition has really helped push this project forward. I'll skip over the overview and future work in the instance of time, but well, this is the final slide I have on the future work. We're working on hybrid optimization, looking at staggered forms of lockdown in our contagion model, trying to understand the biomarker data of group tests rather than just positive or negative tests. We've been implementing reinforcement learning as a technique for testing allocation policies. And we're looking at extensions to other resources such as vaccines or health professionals, as well as looking at strategic behavior in the population or compliance. And thank you. Apologies for rushing a little bit more in the end. Again, I'll be at Gather or any other time. I'm glad to talk about this further with anyone. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Francisco. Yeah, this seems like really impactful work. Yeah, so I think again, we're a little bit over time. I see that there's already one question in the chat though, so we can take the Q&A there. Great. So now the last talk of the session. So unfortunately, the authors, I think we're not able to make it, but we have a recording here. So this is a talk given by Scott Commoners on an economic framework for vaccine prioritization, and I'll get set up to share this now. And Andrew or someone, please let me know if I haven't hooked up the audio correctly when it starts playing.
Okay, just make sure the 2 boxes at the bottom to share audio and optimize for video clip are both checked.
I'm really excited to be presenting this brand new paper on an economic framework for vaccine prioritization. I'm at the same time really sorry for not being there to do so in person. I screwed up time zones and accidentally ended up scheduled to give 2 talks at precisely the same time. So here's a recording. Please get in touch if you have lots of questions and comments. This is joint work with Mohammed Akbarpour, Eric Budish, and Piotr Dvorak, and it builds on the paper by Mohammed and Piotr and me that I presented on Tuesday earlier in the conference. So a classic question in economics and philosophy is, should we allocate via prices or priorities? Or put slightly differently, are there goods that should not be for sale, right? And economists frequently say the answer is no. Why don't we just have markets? We should have markets for things. But in the context of vaccine allocation, over the last half year in the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw most countries, including the United States, opting very much for a priority-based allocation system. They chose systems that allocated earlier access to to medical and healthcare workers and other frontline workers, essential services, grocery workers, and so forth, as well as also high-risk individuals. So people who were, for one reason or another, medically or age risk relative to the disease, like at risk of more serious complications or a much higher exposure. So in this paper, we evaluate these types of policies using mechanism design, and we find, in some sense, surprisingly given economic intuition, that a priority system with rationing can actually outperform price-based allocation rules. And more generally, the optimal mechanism is a hybrid of both prices and priorities. And the key dynamic that's driving this is that the designer's objective in allocating vaccines might not perfectly align with willingness to pay. And there are lots of reasons for this, which we're gonna sort of bin in two very large categories: redistributive concerns and/or externalities of vaccination. So this is a very short talk, but let me quickly lay out a model in order to build some intuition for examples. And this is going to build on top of the paper I presented on Tuesday on redistributive allocation mechanisms by adding sort of a micro foundation that sort of tells us about which agents we would like to target. So we're going to imagine that in the context of a pandemic, agents take privately observed actions, which are safe or risky. And we can think of the safe action as reducing in-person activity to try and minimize exposure. And again, the interpretation of this varies a lot, right? So if you're a professor, that might mean teaching and doing your work from home. If you're in a profession that requires you to go in and interact with people, the safe action might be, is minimizing whatever that interaction. It might be like, taking as many days off as possible. It might be, changing the transportation form you use to get to work. Very different, and we'll show some examples. Your decision of whether to take the safe or risky action is going to depend on the health benefit of avoiding infection and the disutility of precautions, or equivalently, the utility of taking the risky action. What is the private value lost from all of these precautions you've taken? But that decision might be inefficient because of externalities. And again, there are two types of externalities. So if you take the safe action, you have a health externality because you avoid potentially infecting others. But there's a socioeconomic externality as well, which is that you might not be doing whatever a socioeconomically valuable activity you were doing before, right? So if you're a professor who chooses to teach from home, maybe your classes suffer. If you're or if you're a doctor who doesn't come into the office, there's a very real externality there immediately. You also might have, some, individual socioeconomic need, which is captured in the welfare weights, or some socioeconomic desert, right? Again, there's like a heterogeneous welfare weight that sort of says something about how much on the margin we want to favor your utility in the social objective. And again, this is sort of a core part of the framework that Mohammed and Piotr and I have been working with in a series of papers. And all of this is partially observable and partially unobservable. So there's a label which might contain your profession and your neighborhood, some publicly observable information. But beyond that, the designer has to elicit your willingness to pay for the vaccine, which is going to be partially informative about what actions you've been taking and what the benefits of vaccinating you will be. So here are some examples of that. So first of all, if you're a frontline health worker, you sort of are ranked highly in all of these categories, right? You have a high health benefit to avoiding infection, which means high health benefit to choosing the safe action, or equivalently high health benefit to vaccinating you. You also have a high, you have a high socioeconomic value as well, because you're treating patients. And there's a high health externality. If you choose the risky action, then you're going to be interacting with many potentially very high risk people, which means that the health externality of protecting you from the virus is really high, because then you won't infect people. So choosing the safe action has a high health externality. Equivalently, vaccinating you does as well in the event that you end up interacting with patients. And then lastly, we might think that frontline health workers also have a very high lambda, precisely because they're taking risks to save others. There's a lot of argument in medical ethics and ethics more broadly that we want to reward people for that in the social, and encourage it in social welfare terms. By contrast, now, if you're a healthy college student, you might be at lower health risk, because you have more, sort of a more stable immune system and are better able to fight off the virus. Again, these are all in relative terms, and the virus has become more dangerous for young people, especially recently. But relative to a 65-year-old or so, maybe you have a lower health risk. And you might have a medium to high health externality, because if you choose the risky action, you're going to interact with lots of people. You're on a campus. But your preference for social activity might vary. And willingness to pay is going to be informative about your preference for social activity. And by correlation, might inform us about the health externality, because it's sort of, if you have a very high, willingness to pay, it suggests you might in fact be taking, the risky action. V might be high enough that you are choosing to take the risky action, which means you have a health benefit for vaccination and we have a high health externality for vaccinating you. One last example, which is interesting, is if you think about a rideshare driver, they might have, high H and high V, right? If they choose the safe action, they're not earning income. But if they choose the risky action, they're being exposed to lots of people, and so might be exposed to the virus frequently. And they might also have a high health externality in the event, because in the event that they choose the risky action, they're interacting with many people. We might also think, and this is a subject of some of our other work, that these people have a high welfare weight because they're typically lower socioeconomic status. If you observe a high willingness to pay for the vaccine, it could indicate that they're choosing the safe action but really need money and so would like to be able to drive. Or they're choosing the risky action, which means they have a high private health benefit of vaccination and also a high health externality. But either case, high willingness to pay for rideshare drivers indicates high social value to vaccinating. More broadly, for any individual agent, we're going to be able to sort of infer an expected social welfare value for vaccinating them, which integrates the private utility, any revenue that's raised from the allocation, and then the externality terms. And the key insight, which sounds a little backwards, but it makes sense when you think about it, is if the agent is taking the safe action, vaccinating them unleashes the socioeconomic externality by allowing them to return to prior levels of activity. If they're taking the risky action, vaccination unleashes the health externality, because now, they're less likely to infect others. Taking those social welfare values, we sort of extract out the optimal mechanism. And what you're going to find is that some groups, we want prioritized allocation, where basically like everyone in the group gets the vaccine for free and we get sort of the average welfare benefit. We're going to want that then when the average welfare benefit within a group is high. In other groups, you might want to use pricing or queuing or some other mechanism that sorts agents on willingness to pay if you think that there's actually a potentially big difference between the high willingness to pay agents and the low willingness to pay agents in this social value term. Then given that, we're going to allocate vaccines according to marginal expected welfare benefits, and you get a block structure. So first of all, you do often want prioritization, especially even if you allow some pricing. Left side is no pricing, right side is with pricing. Even if you allow pricing, you might want a block structure with prioritization to get those, high risk individuals, those doctors, get people who are sort of very high social value to vaccination on all dimensions, ahead of everyone else. And then you want to sort of sort either on average, social value of vaccination. That's this, when you're doing all prioritized schemes. Or you might have some areas of pricing, some places where you sort of keep sorting until the marginal social value of vaccination equals the average social value of some other group that you're going to do prioritized allocation in. Then you allocate to all of them, and then you return to sort of price-based allocation. Again, you can have different prices within groups to account for socioeconomic disparities and so forth. So that's that's the story in brief. The optimal mechanism is a hybrid with some amount of prioritization and sorting, which ends up looking very much like what we had. Big footnote, of course, this is all assuming equality of access to the distribution system. And a big problem in the United States was that we didn't have that, right? The allocation system, favored people with a lot of sophistication and a lot of excess time, which is exactly the opposite of what you would want here. And so, in terms of welfare weights, like that's a thing that we got wrong. But at the high macro level, sort of the overall scheme, makes a lot of sense. QED, and thank you so much. Please do get in touch if you have questions or further thoughts.
Okay, everyone. Well, thank you all for being here, and thanks to all of the authors. I think that brings us to the end of the session.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Brian. That does bring us to the end of the session and the day. If you have any questions or you want to chat with the other conference attendees, please go to gather, and we'll reconvene again tomorrow at 8 a.m. Pacific. And yes, and we have 2 more days left. So come through. All right. Thank you.